crazy American conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. A couple weeks ago, I made a video about the craziest conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. And in that video, it was kind of concerning how many of these crazy conspiracies were either involving or done by the United States government. And in that video, I said if there was interest, I would make a video specifically focusing on conspiracy theories that involved the US government. And overwhelmingly, you guys demanded that video. And against my better judgment, I made it. So in this video, we're discussing crazy conspiracies that involve the US government. Let's begin. The Tuskegee study. There's a saying that goes, if something is free, then you're probably the product. And that is something that holds very true when it comes to the Tuskegee study. The Tuskegee study was a very disturbing and deceptive study that took place in Tuskegee, Alabama. The study specifically targeted black males and how having an untreated disease would affect them. If you're curious about what that disease may be, then perhaps the other name for this study may lend a hint. The Tuskegee study is also known as the Tuskegee syphilis study. Yeah. This study initially took place from 1929 to 1931 and had relatively innocent intentions. During this time, the Rosen World Fund, a fund that essentially promoted healthcare and education to poor African American farmers, specifically about sexually transmitted diseases. The goal of this initial study was to identify the southern counties in Alabama with the highest rates of syphilis among African American males. At this time, the goal was to simply find this location and find the people within this location that had syphilis and then treat them. Still seeming relatively innocent. This pursuit was successful, and they found that Macon County in Alabama had the highest rate of male syphilis, with over 35% of men being infected with syphilis. Although near the end of 1931 is where this all takes a very dark turn, as during this time the Great Depression was in full swing, and the Rosenwald Fund, which was looking to help the poor African American community, was running out of funding. It was at this point when the Public Health Service, a part of the United States government, approached the Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama to see if they would be willing to continue the study, specifically researching the effects of untreated syphilis in African American males. But they only proposed that they monitor these untreated people for 6 to 9 months to gather data and then at that point treat them fully. Remember this timeline because we'll be referencing this later. The Tuskegee Institute agreed to do this research as they thought it was beneficial, not only for their local population but for all Americans. And it was shortly after, in 1932, when the study began. The study began with 600 men being enrolled into the study. 399 of these men had syphilis, 201 of these men did not. Things already take a dark turn here as all 600 of these men were more or less kept in the dark about what this study exactly was about, and they were really only being told that they were getting free healthcare, something that was hard to come by and an appetizing offer for anybody suffering from any sort of disease. Right? Not only did the government say that they were going to give them free healthcare, they also said that they were going to treat these men of their bad blood, which isn't really a medical condition. It was more or less of a local blanket term that just described general illness. Most of them weren't even necessarily diseases themselves, but symptoms, such as fatigue, body pains, anemia, and even undiagnosed syphilis symptoms as well. These 600 men were specifically promised free medical exams, meals covered by the government, and even burial insurance in case they died during the study. That alone should have seemed like a red flag, but at this time it seemed like a deal that was too good to be true, which is potentially another red flag. So consider that 2 red flags. But back to the point. For the men in this study who were confirmed to have syphilis, the government didn't tell them about their diagnosis, and they didn't even give them any treatment either. Now, at this point, you might be asking, why didn't the government simply find people that they knew had syphilis and then simply request that they have the ability to monitor them? These people already had syphilis, and the US government was willing to incentivize them, so why not inform them about the data that you're collecting? The government claimed they took a deceptive path because it was the only way that these men would have stayed in the study, and for the study to work, they needed to be closely monitored consistently over time. But it's heavily suspected that this deception was based on a lack of respect, both because of racial and economic prejudice. Specifically because the study only involved black men, all of which who were poor farmers, which meant they had limited resources and almost no education as well too. And by limited education, I mean very limited, like fully illiterate. So if you're an educated and prejudiced doctor during this time, why would you give these people any real information? Just keep them in the dark. They don't know any better, right? That doesn't sound ethical to me, but I suppose that was their mindset. So at this point, you may be thinking, sure, okay, the US government wasn't fully upfront and maybe wasn't even respectful to these people that they were studying, but so what? It's not like they gave these people syphilis. These people had syphilis. All they were doing was collecting data. And while I personally would say that there is a ton of ethical issues within that already, that is not the worst part about this study. That is only the beginning of this study. After the initial 9 months that this study was supposed to go on, they decided to extend the study and extend it again and in 1934, the first major paper about the study of untreated syphilis was made public. And if you're thinking that now that there's a paper and they can end the study and finally treat these men, you're unfortunately mistaken. And it was at this point when the study was extended once again. And there was even a push from the medical community not to treat these men, but to actually prevent these men from getting treatment so they could see the prolonged effects of syphilis. And this is where we get to the darkest part of this study. The study actually went on for 40 years. And for a majority of that 40-year period, there was actually an extremely effective and safe treatment available. That being penicillin, which was first used to treat infections in 1930, and by 1945, it was accepted as a proper treatment for syphilis. But of course, these men were kept in the dark about that, and were never offered it or even informed about it. And the government simply just decided to watch these men wither away, to see how this infection affected daily life over an extremely long period of time. By the end of the study, it was estimated that 128 of the men in the study died directly from the syphilis that they had. 40 of the men in this study also infected their wives, and 19 of these men had children that were born with syphilis. Those numbers especially are extremely disheartening because those people didn't even sign up for this deceptive study. They were simply the unintentional victim of the unintentional victim. And a lot of these deaths and infections could have easily been prevented by treating these people like they planned on doing. But instead, they decided to simply withhold treatment and monitor them for 40 years. Something that I think any reasonable person would agree is unethical and honestly horrible. Medical studies require consent, and the patients in the study need to be fully informed of the risks and also treatments available, and they need to be treated with respect. And with the Tuskegee study, none of those measures were taken, and it's truly a dark and shameful part of American medical history. But there is a silver lining to this story, as on July 25th, 1972, a journalist named Jean Heller broke the story about the horrific study that had been going on for the last 40 years. And with this news breaking, the government then decided that this study was ethically unjustified, and that also meant that it was immediately canceled. And the following year, there was actually a class action lawsuit that was filed on behalf of these men who were unknowingly a part of the study, and they did end up winning $9.5 million in 1973 money. So keep in mind, it's adjusted for inflation, it's around $50 million today. I'm sure for some, this money was extremely helpful and went a long way, but many of the participants never even knew that they were part of a study, never saw this money, and simply died because they didn't know what they signed up for. And even if you did live to get part of this settlement, not only is your body worse for wear for never getting treatment for a disease that they knew you had, but you also likely have no trust in the government, as they just spent the last 40 years treating you like a lab rat, and the few dollars that they were forced to throw at you only feels like too little too late. So yeah, the Tuskegee study started by simply trying to identify counties with the highest syphilis population to begin treatment, and ended with a 40-year study that completely violated not only the human rights of the participants, or should I say victims, but also the medical system as a whole. And as upsetting and disturbing as the story is, at least there was some sort of closure associated with it. This is only the first entry on this list, and we have lots more to cover. The Watergate scandal. When I first heard the name of this conspiracy theory or situation, I was convinced that it had something to do with the US government putting something in the water. But as you may know, that's not the case at all. And interestingly, this scandal is also the reason why a lot of other scandals have gate in their name, such as Deflategate, Elsagate, and a lot of other scandals that range from morbid to disturbing. So let's give a bit of context before we get into the details of this Watergate. Richard Nixon was the 37th president of the United States. He was an author, a lawyer, and a career politician. But in 1974, his presidency was cut short as he resigned for reasons that involve the Watergate scandal. This entire scandal is interesting and kind of two-sided because there is the initial acts that took place, and then there is the reaction to the exposure of the initial actions. And if you're already confused, don't worry, because I'm going to lay it out simply as possible. This entire situation begins with Richard Nixon being paranoid that he was not going to win a re-election, something that he feared deeply and was willing to do anything to avoid. This included harassing opposing journalists, politicians, and even celebrities who could potentially influence his re-election in a negative way. And he and his administration would harass them by abusing government power in ways such as auditing them and even getting them involved in strange legal disputes and more. But that's only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the situation. Prior to the 1972 election, the election that Nixon was so fearful of losing, a group of Nixon's associated formed the Creeps. Creeps meaning the Committee to Re-elect the President. An odd and kind of fitting name. This rather elusive group went to some extreme and even illegal measures to ensure that their goal was met. One of their biggest efforts was collecting information on the opposing party, the Democratic Party. And this is where we get to Watergate. This group of creeps were approved to break into and plant listening devices into the Democratic National Committee headquarters, which just so happened to be based in the Watergate office building in Washington, D.C. The group figured that if they could break into their offices and collect data secretly, they could find some dirt and use it against them to make sure that they win the 1972 election. The first time these creeps broke into the office, the mission was successful. However, on their second attempt, all 5 of these men were caught. And this is where the plot thickens. Because nobody knew who these men were, what their motivation was, and what their goal was. All they knew is that there was 5 spies breaking into the Democratic Party's headquarters. Although it's not hard to think of who may have potentially ordered this attack. The FBI began to look deeply into this case to find who exactly was involved and what their motivation and goal was. It was at this point, coincidentally, when Richard Nixon would instruct the CIA to tell the FBI to halt all further investigation on this entire scandal, or at least the finances involved behind the scandal. They were still going to investigate these men, but the funding investigation was blocked. Obviously, this entire situation sparked public outrage, and there was a lot of finger pointing at the Republican Party, specifically at the president himself. And although he and his party strictly denied any involvement or awareness of this essentially spy operation, information was flowing in and the house of cards was crumbling. One of the early pieces of evidence that pointed towards Nixon was the fact that one of these men who conducted this robbery was actually a Republican aide. And on top of that, they had an informant who was feeding them information directly connecting these burglars to Richard Nixon himself. And I swear I'm not even making it up, this informant or whistleblower went by the alias of Deep Throat. Shout out Deep Throat for the information. I feel like if you called the government right now and told them you had information, but you wanted to go by the name Deep Throat, you'd probably get hung up on, but that's just me. Now, despite all of this media attention and this obviously odd situation going on, Nixon did obviously win the election in 1972. However, that was short-lived. The following year in 1973, 4 of Nixon's top aides lost their job because they were involved directly in the cover-up. Through months and months of consistent investigations, there was only more and more dots being connected and lines being drawn directly back to Richard Nixon from these burglars and from this entire scandal. And while everything was still relatively unconfirmed, it became more and more plausible that Richard Nixon not only knew about this situation, but was also directly involved. And it was at this point as well when Richard Nixon's own assistant broke the news that Richard Nixon had installed spy devices all around the White House. And while his intentions aren't fully known, I would assume he did this to benefit himself. And unfortunately for him, these recording devices actually became his downfall, as they were able to prove his involvement. When Nixon's assistant broke the news in court that these devices were installed, the government instantly subpoenaed these devices to hear the recordings that he had captured. And of course, Nixon honored the subpoena and handed over these recording devices, right? No, obviously not. He not only denied to hand them over, but he also exercised an executive privilege, stating that the president should have some right to privacy, which obviously isn't what this was about at all. Eventually, these tapes were handed over, and after thoroughly being reviewed, it was confirmed that Richard Nixon knew exactly what was going on and was even providing hush money to these creeps. The president had 2 options: resign or be impeached. And as we know, on August 8th, 1974, he resigned as the United States president. This entire situation put people in jail, changed laws, and also changed US politics forever, as it was the first ever resignation of a president in the history of the United States. This conspiracy or scandal may not seem extremely shocking at this point, because I feel like nowadays trust in the government is at an all-time low, but that wasn't always the case. And there was a point in time when people had trust and respect for the powers that be and believed that they had integrity. This situation is undeniably bad, as it's a blatant abuse of power and is a demonstration of a president fighting dirty for his own gain. And while justice was served and there was a happy ending to this story, the situation really only exposed likely something that was already going on. So yeah, the president wanted to maintain his power, did some shady things to collect some information to win the presidency, but what's considered worst of all is the fact that he not only denied and lied about the situation, but also used executive orders to prevent the truth from being revealed. Regardless, people in these high positions of power should be held to a high standard, and integrity and honesty should come first. And I hope someday we can return to that. But yeah, let's keep going. Project MKUltra. MKUltra is one of the most notorious and disturbing covert operations in all of US history. And it's for that reason that I'm going to keep this section pretty brief and try my best to make sure that I really only focus on information that you may not have heard yet if you're already familiar. This entire conspiracy theory had one single goal: to explore the methods of mind control and behavioral manipulation in humans. The reason this operation even started was because after the Korean War, American prisoners of war who were being returned home seemed to have been brainwashed, as they were consistently repeating what they believed to be communist propaganda. To the American government, this was very concerning because they assumed this had to be the result of brainwashing from their communist opposition, which meant that if these communists had mind control techniques that the Americans didn't, then they had an advantage over America. And obviously this meant that they needed to develop their own mind control techniques, or at least explore how they would go about it. Already, we're on a pretty disturbing note, but this really does only get worse from here. It was after this discovery when the CIA, which was relatively new at the time, was given $25 million to perform psychiatric experiments on humans. At the time, this was the most hidden and secretive project that the CIA and the US government as a whole was performing. And it'll become pretty obvious why when we get into the details. The government was finding patients at psychiatric hospitals, prisoners from federal prisons, and even random members of the public. And what they would do is dose them with drugs without their awareness and then do experiments on them to see how the drugs affected them. One of the most interesting and notable operations in MKUltra was an operation known as Operation Midnight Climax, which has an oddly fitting name, and essentially consisted of the US government building safe houses. And what these safe houses were essentially fake plant houses where US government funded prostitutes would lure men into these houses and then dose them with LSD where they were being observed, typically behind a two-way mirror in that very safe house. In the last section, we talked about creeps in the government, but this brings it to a whole nother level. Not only were they paying prostitutes to lure men to essentially trapped houses, they would also dose them with drugs without their consent and experiment on them. But that's still only the tip of the iceberg. Another interesting thing that they did was hosting LSD parties, which was essentially a party where music was played and LSD was unknowingly given to the participants of this party. And these scientists would simply observe these people on LSD to see how they would react. And it's believed that these ongoing tests were actually a precursor to the hippie movement, or at least part of it, which is interesting. But MKUltra wasn't just prostitutes and partying. There was a lot of medical mismanagement, most famously at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, Canada, where patients with relatively minor ailments would be taken advantage of and experimented on with aggressive drug cocktails. The main doctor at this institute, known as Dr. Cameron, pursued a concept that he called depatterning, and this concept and practice was truly evil. The goal of this practice was to reduce patients to an infantile psychological state, essentially giving an adult the mind of a child. And the point of bringing people to the state was so that the government could take advantage of this extremely vulnerable position and from that point rebuild their mind, giving them an entirely new psyche, thought process, mindset, and belief system to essentially control this person fully. Besides dosing these people with drugs, they would also put these people into comas and play messages over and over again until they sunk deep into the person's subconscious. And they even performed electroshock therapy and other forms of extreme therapy on these people as well. Disturbingly, this entire project went on for 20 years, from 1953 to 1973. And while it's not known the true number of people that were unknowingly experimented on by the US government in this 20-year period, it's likely safe to assume that there was hundreds, if not thousands, of victims of this disturbing study, many of which who were simply never the same, for reasons that they would never understand why. If you're experienced with drugs, then you likely understand how bad it is to have a bad trip, and you likely understand how detrimental it could be for someone who's never had a psychedelic experience to have an unknowing dose put upon them. That experience, for many, is likely completely mind-altering and also extremely terrifying, and it's quite disturbing how many people this had happened to. Although, once again, there is some sort of happy ending, I suppose, as in 1973, the operation was closed, once again by a whistleblower, although this time the whistleblower's name wasn't Deep Throat. His name was actually 69 Lord, I'm just joking. His name was John Marks, and he wrote a book named The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, where he exposed most of the operation. And at that point, after this information had been exposed, congressional hearings began to investigate what was really going on. And it was through those hearings where the CIA not only admitted that the operation existed, but they also were forced to admit what they were doing. To this day, there has been no class action lawsuit, no apology, nothing. And the children of some of these victims are still pursuing legal action against the institutes that they deem responsible. And personally, I hope justice is truly served, as awareness and exposure is one thing, but justice goes beyond just that. It's so ironic that after the Korean War, the US government publicly exposed and shamed these communist countries for their mind control techniques and how they could possibly brainwash prisoners of war and torture them. But almost immediately after giving a speech about how horrible these things are, they then begin not only researching their own methods of doing the exact same thing, but they go about it in likely the worst way possible. And Project MKUltra is a massive example of the US government breaking moral, ethical, and legal laws in their own self-interest, and it's one that people have not forgotten, nor should they ever. What do you guys think? Feel free to let me know in the comments. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video was made because of your overwhelming interest and support in the comments of the last video. So I just quickly wanted to make the same offer again. If you guys liked this video and would like me to make a part 2 about crazy conspiracies that the US government has been involved in, then please leave a comment telling me that you want part 2. I try to read as many comments as possible, and I take your guys' suggestions seriously. So yeah, I thought I'd just mention that quickly. But without further ado, let's get to the last entry of this list: the Iran-Contra affair. The US is still very much in a Cold War against Russia, and is still very much so anti-communist. And it was at this time when the president, Ronald Reagan, promised to support anti-communist insurgencies around the world. Meaning that if you were a country that was currently dealing with a potential rise in communism or the threat of communism, the US had your back to make sure that that wasn't a problem. Typically by providing arms, or at the very least, training. Reagan was particularly interested in a group known as the Contras, and this group was at war with another group within Nicaragua, known as the Sandinistas. The biggest difference between these two groups was the fact that the Sandinistas was a communist group, and they were backed by Cuba. The president, Ronald Reagan, saw the Contras as a noble force, and even equated them to being similar to the founding fathers as they were fighting for freedom. Now this is where things begin to get sticky. The Contras were funding their war primarily through the drug trade, and because of this, the American government actually passed an amendment known as the Boland Amendment, preventing the US government from providing the Contras with any support due to their involvement in the drug trade. So far, this is pretty straightforward and seems reasonable enough. However, it was at this point when Ronald Reagan decided that he didn't want to follow this amendment and continued to support the Contras regardless of the amendment. And how they did this is a bit confusing, as where they went next was Iran. At the time, in 1985, Iran had 7 American hostages that they were keeping in Lebanon, and Reagan wanted to do everything he could to make sure that these hostages came home alive. It was at this point when the government made a deal. The US government, with Reagan's approval, agreed to give Iran weapons in exchange for the release of the hostages. It's important to note that this was all happening behind closed doors, because publicly, Reagan was saying that he would not negotiate with terrorists, and there was even a trade embargo currently going on with Iran at the time. But that's still only where things begin, as the US government technically budgeted $30 million to go to Iran for this terrorist negotiation, although it was shortly after exposed that only $12 million of this $30 million actually went to Iran, and the remaining $18 million actually went to support the Contras, a group that the US government was not allowed to support. This is a bit of a double whammy, because not only was the government negotiating with terrorists, something that they said they would not be doing, but they were also supporting a group that they were not allowed to support. And this was all exposed by a Lebanese journalist in 1986, and the fallout of this is where we truly see the impact of the entire situation. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who was in charge of most of these operations, came clean about his involvement and said that he knew it happened, he was part of it, and he also admitted that Reagan knew about all of it. This testimony from the colonel and pressure from journalists caused investigations to be launched against Reagan, not just at the time, but for the entirety of his presidency from that point on. And after these investigations, it was ruled that Reagan's involvement was more or less benign and was simply due to a lack of oversight, and because of this, he was not implicated directly, meaning he wasn't in trouble. At least until 1987, when Reagan finally testified on this entire matter. And while these hearings went on for 41 days and were publicly televised, Reagan would still not face any consequences. However, that wasn't the case for everybody. 12 people involved in this conspiracy were charged and found guilty. Those people being Robert McFarlane, Colonel Oliver North, 4 CIA officers, 5 government contractors, and Reagan's national security advisor, John Poindexter. Undoubtedly, this entire situation stained Reagan's image as a president and as an honest man. However, surprisingly, he was never impeached, never resigned, and actually left office with one of the highest approval ratings in US history, which to me either seems that people were uninformed about the situation or simply agreed with what happened, although it wasn't legal. Not only did it expose a level of distrust for the government, like in Watergate, but it also resulted in the US government literally giving an opposing terrorist organization $12 million out of a hypothetical $30 million that was supposed to be given to them, which I think a lot of people would consider to be a conflict of interest. And while obviously getting hostages home is important, giving them a proposed $30 million of weaponry seems a bit counterintuitive. Combine that to secretly funneling money to an organization that is currently trying to overthrow the Nicaraguan government that is funded by the drug trade, that's an entirely different can of worms as well too. And whether or not you think these actions were justified or moral, that's a decision that you have to make for yourself. But the point is the fact that the government was lying directly to the face of the people and doing things that they likely would have not voted towards or supported, which some would consider to be unlawful, unmoral, and unethical. And if the person you're supposed to trust is saying one thing to your face and then behind closed doors doing essentially the exact opposite, it's not a good look for the trust and faith in the institution that you're running. And I suppose with that, I do want to make a quick point that although this video is focusing on negative things that the US government has done and been involved with, I don't want you leaving this video with a huge doom and gloom mentality. And I think it's important to note that the government is simply a group of people, and people are dumb for the most part and self-interested. And for that reason, the government is going to reflect the people that it's made up of. That doesn't excuse them of any of its responsibility, although it's important to note that the government isn't this otherworldly thing that is perfect. It's really not. It's literally just people. And ideally, we'd have great people in there looking out for other people, but obviously that's not always the case. But with that being said, I think the point of this video and the mindset I'd like you to leave this video with is not to say that the US government or any particular government is evil and horrible and out to get you. I think it's important to note and be aware of times where the government or any institution has done horrible things, be aware of them, hold them accountable, and also do everything in our power to learn from them and prevent them from ever happening again. And the more things that we're able to expose and have out in the open, the more we're going to be able to see the signs in the future and prevent further negative things from happening. But maybe I'm just too optimistic. Let me know what you guys think. The scariest creepypastas that terrified us as kids. I can remember it like it was yesterday. Being at my friend's house at a sleepover, hanging out in the pillow fort we just built, watching scary videos on his iPad mini. Videos that subsequently caused my friend to pee the bed, and me to call my mom crying because I couldn't sleep. The videos that we were watching were people reading creepypastas, and at the time, they were the most terrifying thing a young bro could imagine. Whether a similar situation happened to you a decade ago, or maybe even last week, if you can relate to watching creepypastas late at night, then today's video is going to be nostalgic. But in case you're unfamiliar with creepypastas at all, and you've never been exposed to any of the original stories, don't worry, because you're about to get a masterclass in early internet horror culture. And if you're still confused on what a creepypasta even is, it's really just an online horror story that got shared around a lot. The intro story I just told was not a creepypasta. It was real. I truly do still remember it to this day because this sleepover really opened my eyes to online horror, although in a very unfortunate way. Mainly because the person I was sleeping over with, I was sharing a bed with. And not only did they pee the bed, but they peed on me. So in retaliation, I peed on them in their bed. Just kidding. Or am I? Regardless, the creepypasta that caused us both so much distress was one of the most iconic of all time. It is known as Jeff the Killer. And since this creepypasta traumatized me most as a kid, it deserves the first spot on this list. Looking back at it, after recently rereading the Jeff the Killer creepypasta, it's kind of hilarious how much this scared me, considering how poorly the story is actually written. And there's a good chance that the person who wrote the Jeff the Killer creepypasta was no older than 14. If you're unfamiliar, the Jeff the Killer creepypasta all kind of orbits around this one singular image. An image of a disfigured person with bright white skin, deep black eyes, a wide red smile, and thin black hair. The image admittedly is creepy and is likely burned into a lot of our psyches from being exposed to it so much at such a young age. Interestingly, the Jeff the Killer character and the creepypasta associated with it came out at different times and were created by completely separate people. The actual character of Jeff the Killer was created by somebody with the alias Susur, and this person exclusively created the aesthetic and the actual character known as Jeff the Killer. However, the creepypasta associated with this character was published by an online user named Game Fuel TV and appeared online roughly roughly around 2011, which is probably the same year that I was exposed to it as well. It's pretty cool that somebody could just create an image, toss it online, and somebody else could write an entire backstory and then have the entire ensemble just explode in popularity. But that was something I learned doing research for this that I thought was interesting. I'm not going to read all of the creepypastas I'm mentioning in this video, but I will be giving brief summaries for each of their stories in case you're either unfamiliar or just need a refresher on the actual lore of the creepypasta. The entire Jeff the Killer story centers around a teenage boy named Jeff, a boy that was only roughly 11 or 12 years old, and he and his family moved to a brand new town where his life essentially got flipped upside down. Not like the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air though. The creepypasta itself goes into multiple action sequences about 12-year-old boys getting into knife fights and pouring bleach on each other and setting each other on fire. But to summarize that story as simply as possible, Jeff stabs somebody out of self-defense and his brother takes the blame for it, so Jeff is still free. And then the friends of the people that Jeff stabbed come back for retaliation at this kid's birthday party, and then Jeff stabs the 2 other kids, and then the first kid that he stabbed that still lived covers Jeff in bleach and alcohol and then sets him on fire. But this doesn't kill Jeff. He actually wakes up in the hospital and he is completely disformed. His skin is bleached white, his hair is singed black, and his eyes are deep into his skull. And when he wakes up in the hospital surrounded by family, all of his friends and family are terrified by his presence, but not him. During the altercation he had where he literally killed 2 other children, his psyche broke, which was alluded to earlier in the story because, earlier in the creepypasta, there was literally just random points where the author said, Jeff had a feeling, and then it would move on. Regardless, after killing multiple children in kind of self-defense, and then being set on fire and nearly killed, his psyche breaks, and because of this, when he sees his new appearance in the reflection, he loves it, and he is happy to be this monster. After leaving the hospital and going home, being all now deformed and crazy, he takes a knife in the bathroom alone, cuts off his eyelids, and cuts smile scars into his cheeks, which once he completes doing this, his mom walks in on him in the bathroom, acts calm, runs to get Jeff's dad, they both come back, Jeff kills them both, and then Jeff kills his brother, and that's kind of the end of the story. One of the most iconic lines out of the entire creepypasta and Jeff the Killer's kind of slogan is, "Go to sleep," which is what he said to his brother right before he killed him at the end of the creepypasta. At the time of listening to this story in my friend's pillow fort, there was literally nothing more terrifying I could imagine. And I'm not over-exaggerating when I say that this genuinely messed me up for a few days, and I'm sure at least a few of you can relate to that. Although, if you haven't given this a full read-through recently or ever, give it a read. Or literally listen to the Creepcast episode where they read the story, because their commentary on just how poorly written this story is actually hilarious.
He had a feeling that was a feeling. It wasn't a painful feeling, but it was a weird feeling.
But yeah, Jeff the Killer started as somebody's artistic project on DeviantArt back in 2008. But a few years later, when somebody decided to add their own backstory to this image, it not only gained traction, but it created an internet icon, and subsequently changed online horror and creepypastas forever. I'm sure there is people that recognize this picture that don't even know what a creepypasta is. And if that's you watching this video, then hey, what's up? But we've still got a lot more to discuss. The next creepypasta I want to discuss is one that's almost, if not as iconic as Jeff the Killer, and it's known as the Russian sleep experiment. The Russian sleep experiment is interesting because not only was the story extremely popular and shared widely online over the last decade, but this creepypasta is unique because it is likely the most believed creepypasta of all time. And to this day, I have people in my comments requesting that I talk about the Russian sleep experiment in my human experiments videos as if it's a real thing. Which, if this is news to you, I apologize to admit that the Russian sleep experiment is not real. Although the compelling storytelling and sort of pseudo-historical aspect of it is really kind of believable. The Russian sleep experiment, similar to Jeff the Killer, also has an iconic image associated with it. And it's an image I can only describe as, well, disturbing. It's like a disheveled creature hunched over on a chair, almost looking mummified. Now, if this image is disturbing you to look at, let me just quickly break the facade and show you what this image is actually based on. This is not a real image of anybody. This is actually an image of a Halloween decoration that was slightly edited, which is also hilarious to think that a Halloween decoration fooled likely hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. The origins of the Russian sleep experiment date back to August 10th, 2010, when the story was published to the Creepypasta wiki by a user known as Orange Soda. 15 years later, I'm sure he didn't assume that his story he wrote would still be fooling thousands and thousands of people to this day. Regardless, the compelling story essentially goes as follows. The Creepypasta claims that in 1947, the Soviet government was conducting a test of a new stimulant gas that would prevent prevent the need for sleep in human patients. Obviously, with this stimulant being rather experimental, the Soviet government needed to test it, so they opted to pick 5 political prisoners that they already had in captivity and essentially offer them freedom if they were willing to conduct an experiment. These 5 political prisoners were placed in an airtight chamber that had thick cement walls and multi-inch thick glass portholes to see in and to see out. There was numerous microphones placed on the inside of the chamber so the scientists could hear the subjects, and there was also a PA system inside of the chamber so that the scientists could speak to the subjects if needed. The goal was to test what exactly would happen to these 5 prisoners in this chamber after being exposed to this stimulant gas and no sleep for 30 days. Once the test subjects were placed in the chamber, the door was shut and sealed, and communication from the scientists to the subjects stopped. The chamber slowly began to fill with the perfect ratio of stimulant gas to air to ensure that the subjects were consistently dosed with this chemical without causing an overexposure and chemical toxicity. The story goes on to claim that only a few days into this experiment, people's psyches begin to crumble. And 4 days into this 30-day experiment, these people went from having casual conversations with each other to being very paranoid about each other, talking almost exclusively about traumatic and dark experiences, and then only 6 days into the experiment, basically avoiding each other altogether, being very paranoid and suspicious of each other. Because of this, all of the subjects would whisper into the microphone to the scientists things about the other subjects, almost trying to barter with the scientists, offering information on the other subjects in return for freedom. Shortly after this, one of the subjects began screaming at the top of his lungs, and he screamed until he couldn't scream anymore. And then another subject began to scream until he couldn't scream anymore. It was after the screaming began that one of the non-screaming patients decided to use fecal matter and newspaper to cover up all of the portholes, and then the chamber went quiet. And at this point, the scientists had no input. They couldn't see inside the chamber, they couldn't hear anything inside the chamber, and they weren't even sure if the people inside were alive. The scientists had a rule of not disturbing anything inside the chamber so that they could monitor the actual side effects of being exposed to the stimulant and the stimulant only. Roughly 14 days into the experiment, the scientists broke the rule and made communications with the subjects inside. But it was at this point when they got an interesting reply. Only one of the subjects calmly replied, telling the scientists that they didn't want to leave the chamber anymore. They didn't want to sleep, and they didn't want to live in a world without this chemical stimulant. The scientists were shocked and didn't know what was going on inside and who was alive. So they made the decision to go inside the chamber and check it out. Soviet soldiers opened the chamber, went inside, and saw likely one of the most disturbing sights they had ever seen. All of the living subjects at this point were disheveled, malnourished, and had picked away at their own skin and flesh. Blood was everywhere, and one of the subjects was literally eaten alive by the others, and his flesh was used to clog one of the drain holes in the floor, likely to keep a higher concentration of the gas in the chamber. One of these subjects was taken in for testing, and it was in the hospital room when he was able to break free until he was once again sedated, finally slept after 15 days, and died. The story itself is really crazy, and honestly, I gave this story a bit more detail than I'm gonna give the other sections, simply because the story is actually really good, and it's just so iconic. And if you had the time, I would definitely recommend re-listening to the story itself, and even reading it, depending on your preference. But yeah, the Russian sleep experiment is not real, but it is a great and iconic creepypasta. This next creepypasta opens up an entirely new niche of creepypasta, that being creepypastas based on video games. And I figured what better place to start than Sonic.exe. Growing up, I played a couple random Sonic games on the GameCube, but I wasn't really too deep into the lore. Although when I was first exposed to the story, it still had a rather profound effect on how I saw the entire franchise. Sonic.exe was interesting because for me, and for probably many people, it was the first creepypasta that they experienced based on a character that they already knew and had somewhat of a understanding of and potentially relationship with. Which is why I think for a lot of people, this creepypasta was impactful. The imagery associated with this creepypasta is, unsurprisingly, a depiction of Sonic, although a more devious looking Sonic, specifically with deep black eyes, small red pupils, and seemingly blood dripping out of his eye sockets. Oh, and of course, an evil grin. You can't forget the evil grin. The creepypasta series itself was created by Jack Cranley, and since then has been remixed and retold and continued by others who were inspired by the original creepypasta series and wanted to make this character their own, which is somewhat common across all creepypasta characters. For example, Jeff the Killer appears in a ton of other creepypasta stories just kind of randomly, as if it was a cameo of sorts. But that's part of the fun of telling these stories. The Sonic.exe creepypasta definitely wasn't believable, but it was still somewhat based in reality, which for me, as a a kid reading it definitely drew me right into the storyline. The creepypasta goes as follows. A person receives a mysterious unmarked disc that contains a bootleg version of a Sonic game. They decide to play this game and realize that it's not an ordinary Sonic game, and it's not even a regular bootleg either. The character itself looks demonic, and the gameplay is also twisted. In this bootleg version of the game, Sonic stalks, torments, kills, and tortures all of his friends, colleagues, and enemies in different gruesome ways. The bright and cheerful world of Green Hill Zone was no longer, and was now blood-soaked, dark, cloudy, off-putting, and cryptic messages were common across the entirety of the game, with the most memorable being, "I am God." As you would progress within the game, it would seemingly become more and more corrupt. Random flashing lights, random noises, random images, and the Sonic character that you played at slowly becoming sentient and breaking the fourth wall. This then leads to the actual player who got this mysterious disc to experience hallucinations and then receive an even more cryptic message from the entity that actually created the game. And I'll just leave it at that, as to not get too deep into the weeds on the entire story. Sonic.exe is much like Jeff the Killer in the sense that it really kicked off an entire genre. In this case, the genre of haunted video games, and taking iconic, happy, cheerful childhood characters and making them twisted and making an entirely new reality based off of that. The concept is definitely enticing because the world already exists, and your job as an author is to simply make it as dark as possible. It's also pretty similar to Jeff the Killer in the fact that it's just poorly written. Like, if you really want a good laugh, go back and read the actual story. But it almost doesn't even matter how poorly written the original story was, because it was still enough to spark a movement. So sure, it may have not been a literary masterpiece, it was definitely culturally significant when it comes to online horror. But getting off the topic of video games and staying in the realm of cursed media, I want to talk about a creepypasta that deeply, deeply disturbed me as a kid. This creepypasta was based on a TV show that I watched a lot as a kid, and you likely did too. And the story was known as Squidward's Suicide. If you watched SpongeBob growing up like me, you know that Squidward is always the grumpy, kind of unhappy guy. But in this creepypasta, it claims that there is a lost episode of SpongeBob where Squidward isn't just his regular grumpy self. He actually reaches his breaking point and essentially ends it all. This creepypasta was posted on August 8th, 2010, and was written by a user named Suicide Squidward, which is interesting. The story claims that in 2005, an intern at Nickelodeon Studios had stumbled upon a lost episode of SpongeBob. The intern decided to see what this episode was all about. The episode starts normally, although the title card is an interesting piece of foreshadowing, where it explicitly states that the episode's title is Squidward's Suicide, but then goes back to the regular happy music and everything you would associate to be in a SpongeBob episode. The episode starts with Squidward practicing the clarinet for an upcoming concert, but when the concert comes, nobody likes it, and everybody hates it and boos at Squidward. And because of this, it quickly cuts to Squidward being extremely upset, sitting on the side of his bed, essentially contemplating his life. And it's at this time when all you can hear is a disturbing cry that turns into a deafening sob that goes on for minutes and minutes. And on screen, you can only see the camera zoom more and more in Squidward's face. But then quickly, images begin to flash over top of what was already on screen. Only visible for frames at a time, there was brutal images of mangled, dead children simply interjected into this episode of SpongeBob. But there wasn't just one image. There was multiple images of people that were dead, dismembered, and these were real graphic images superimposed onto the children's cartoon. The creepypasta basically just ends with nobody knowing who made this episode or where it came from or who the images of these victims were that were imposed onto this episode, which was kind of part of the disturbing lore because these were pictures of real dead people, but nobody knew if these victims had justice served to whoever did this to them or not, and it was just kind of all really gross and disgusting. And this was one of the ones that rereading it now, I guess with the Russian sleep experiment, really just kind of got me. Not necessarily in a literary sense, but I definitely have a very vivid imagination, and the way that this is written is you really can't not see what they're describing. I've kind of recommended reading the other ones. I would recommend skipping this one and just understanding that this one is just dark. Oh, and I didn't even mention it yet, but the image that's like most associated with this is an image you'd likely have seen before. Just an image of Squidward in a dark room standing in front of a window. His skin is a pale gray and his eyes are extremely dark, red pupils, once again dripping blood. And coupled with all of this, Squidward is wearing his signature frown. But while we're still talking about creepypastas based on essentially cursed content, let's finish the trilogy and jump back to another video game-focused creepypasta. And this one isn't necessarily as culturally significant as the other two, but still, at least for me, had a big impact and I think overall is an interesting story. It's known as Pokemon Strangled Red. And it's almost a combination of the last two creepypastas I just discussed. This creepypasta was first seen on September 6th, 2011 on the Creepypasta fandom website, and it was written by user Shadow Male Renamon. There's a bootleg version of a Pokemon game titled Strangled Red. A person begins to play it, and it starts to seem normal, but a little bit uncanny, and then consistently gets darker and darker. You play as a trainer named Steven. Steven was upset about a Pokemon of his that died. It was a Charizard named Mickey. And this undertone really gives a grim outlook on the game, and then with all of the eerie music, glitchy visuals, and dark dialogue, the game only gets more and more disturbing, until you're literally faced with violent scenes and, well, Steven's descent into madness and his own demise. The story itself is decently well written and interesting for sure, and although it wasn't as culturally significant as the others we've suggested, I figured it was still worthy of a spot on this list, and I wanted to at least mention it. It definitely scared me as a kid, and I'm sure it scared at least a few of you as well. But let's keep going. Let's take a break from the twisted content for just a second and get into the real world and talk about some real things. That, of course, being the Goatman. And if you've watched my videos on cryptids and urban legends, then you would have heard me talk about the Goatman and the Pope Lake Monster a while back. And this ties directly into that, and it's kind of multifaceted, because the Goatman creepypasta most famously associated with the Goatman's demonic bridge, which there's a ton of videos about this bridge. But this video is not about that. This video is about a creepypasta associated with the Goatman urban legend, which is kind of meta. A creepypasta based on an urban legend, based on absolute fact, I'm sure. The specific creepypasta I'm mentioning associated with the Goatman is known as Anasi's Goatman Story, and was originally posted on 4chan, of all places, on September 28th, 2012. This creepypasta admittedly is not one that I actually stumbled upon when I was younger, but when doing research for this video, it was overwhelming how many people felt nostalgic about the story, specifically because a lot of the videos of people reading the story on YouTube today still have comments about people who come back to it often because they just find the story so good. And while it's not the best written story ever, it is definitely unique, which is a trait that's not common when it comes to creepypastas, because most creepypastas typically find themselves either following similar formats or simply using the same tropes over and over again, making creepypastas repetitive and, in a lot of cases, just cringe and unreadable. That being said, the creepypasta associated with the Goatman is pretty unique, specifically because it doesn't rely on gruesome gore or jump scares or anything extremely morbid. What it does do is lean into more psychological horror with a very slow build-up and a rather interesting payoff. The creepypasta goes as follows. A group of teenagers go on a camping trip for the weekend. They head into some woods near a Native American reservation, and initially they are enjoying the time in the woods. They're playing sports, they're playing games, they're enjoying themselves. But as the day goes on, they've noticed small, interesting things. A foul smell that's been in the air on and off. And now, more recently, later in the day, strange noises appearing in the bushes. Nothing too concerning though, until you and your friends decide to build a fire and relax. When your group notices that there's more people at the campfire than there should be, but nobody knows who has joined them or why. Somebody sitting at the campfire is an imposter, but it is impossible to tell who. And this is where the slow build happens. There is tension and paranoia building within the group because there is more people than they should be. And at this point, they don't know who is who. And everybody is beginning to turn on each other when the group comes to the conclusion that there is a shapeshifter in the group. There's obviously more to the story, but I think that encapsulates the most important part of the story. The aspect of the psychological element of this horror story. It's not necessarily about the gruesome deaths that happen or the disturbing imagery. It's that you are going out with your friends and having fun until somebody else joins your group that nobody noticed, and now nobody can tell who's supposed to be here and who's not. And then the slow game about who is this and how can we tell? And basically just imagine playing Among Us with your friends, but in real life, and your actual life is on the line. And I'm not being vague to be coy. I don't want to spoil it for people who want to go experience the story in full. But trust me, this one's definitely worth a read or a listen. And I wanted to add it to this list because it is typically regarded as one of the most unique and obviously one of the most iconic original creepypastas. I started this video strong, and I knew I had to end this video even stronger. So for the last entry on this list, I have to put probably the most iconic creepypasta character of all time. A character that has not only creepypastas, but games and movies and then some. This is probably the only creepypasta on the list that your mom has a good chance of recognizing due to the mass amount of Halloween costumes in just popular media. And if you haven't guessed it yet, I'm of course talking about the Slenderman. The Slenderman holds such a near and dear place in my heart because it is so iconic and for some reason was such a big part of my childhood as well too. I remember watching all of my favorite YouTubers play the game. I remember reading the creepypasta with my friends in school and getting scared. And I remember even trying to download the game online and getting a virus on my family computer when trying to be a YouTuber when I was like 10. And don't even get me started about how my pants began to fall off as I was downloading this game, and it was just crazy. There was a virus, but that's a whole different story. The iconic aesthetic and look of this Slenderman character dates back to 2009, when there was a Photoshop contest on the Something Awful forums. This contest was the catalyst for the Slenderman character, and from that point on, it was game over. The person who originally created the character was named Eric Knudsen, and his simple depiction of a tall, humanoid, yet featureless figure wearing a black suit was simple and vague and uncanny enough to spark so many different fan stories and fan fiction, but we're not going to talk about that. The original Slenderman creepypasta story was released on January 14th, 2010, which I just want to say 2010 was such a good year for creepypasta, and possibly the peak and golden era of creepypastas as a whole. Regardless, there is now so much media associated with the Slenderman character. I just kind of want to talk about the character as a whole, because at this point I could talk about different stories for days. The general vibe and consistent theme across all media associated with the Slenderman is just the following, is that he is almost exclusively around children, typically stalking them, slaughtering them, and potentially doing other things as well, which aren't even known. Slenderman is most commonly photographed with large groups of children, which is actually where the origin photos come from. During this Photoshop contest, the photoshopping was actually just a group of children with this uncanny figure superimposed in the background, as we showed previously. In some articles, it's claimed that Slenderman even mentally influences these children and drives them into madness, and in others it's claimed that he simply abducts them and they are never seen again. Regardless, the Slenderman has an affinity for children, which alone is already creepy enough, coupled with his simple yet terrifying look. Part of the charm is the Slenderman is kind of the fact that less is more. Literally nothing is known about this character. There's no motives, he's never spoken, there's really no origin story. He typically was seen in pictures, not videos, meaning it's not even certain how he moves, unless you've obviously seen it in videos or played the game, but it's just ominous. A featureless, emotionless, potentially thoughtless figure, resembling a human, yet missing anything that would meaningfully make it a human. It's kind of genius. And combine that with, vulnerable children just being in the mix, and you have a, scary story. The Slenderman has been known to abduct children either in suburban areas, but most typically in the woods, lurking behind trees and shadows. And I'll be honest, out of all of the creepypastas that I've mentioned and experienced when I was younger, even as an adult, this was one of the ones that definitely had me turning off the lights and running up the stairs as fast as possible. Because, if the basement was dark and I was leaving it, there was a possibility that Slenderman could be there and wanting to abduct me. These are some of my favorite creepypastas that I remember from my childhood. And hopefully for you, this was entertaining and potentially even nostalgic as well. Cryptids from every state in the United States of America. Alabama. One of the most famous cryptids in Alabama is known as the White Thang, or the White Thang of Alabama. Supposedly, the White Thang is the most famous cryptid from Alabama. The creature has been spotted throughout the 1990s, and the local news, WAFF48, has published articles discussing it. One of the articles discussed how the White Thang and the Sasquatch are different, but how they may be potentially distantly related. Oh, yeah, and if you can tell by the pictures on screen, White Thang is essentially just a big Bigfoot, but he's white, hence the name. Alaska. One of the most interesting cryptids from Alaska is known as Tizaruk, and it is believed to be a sea serpent reported from the subarctic coastal waters of King and Nunavut Islands in the Bering Sea, off the Pacific coast of Alaska. People that have claimed to see Tizaruk typically claim to either only see their head and neck or occasionally the tail. Therefore, the general form of this animal is unknown, but it can allegedly rise out of the water almost 7 to 8 feet. Its head is snake-like and its tail is flippered, but the Tezerek has also been described as a giant caterpillar or worm-like creature. This is essentially the Loch Ness Monster of Alaska. There isn't really much known about this creature, but I thought it would be more interesting than another Bigfoot variant, just so this list isn't full of them. Arizona, the Mogollon Monster. The Mogollon Monster is commonly described as a large bipedal creature, which means it walks on 2 feet. Originally, I thought that meant it had 2 penises, but it turns out he's not that cool. It's also described as being over 7 feet tall small with large red eyes. Its body is said to be covered with long, black, or reddish-brown hair with the exclusion of hair on its chest, face, feet, or hands. Reports claim it also has a strong, pungent odor like dead fish, skunk, bad body odor, or even decaying peat moss, or the musk of a snapping turtle. Some people claim that the creature is allegedly nocturnal, omnivorous, and territorial, and sometimes violent. In numerous reports, the monster has been said to emit a blood-curdling scream, described as sounding like a woman in great distress. The Mogollon monster is also known as the Arizona Bigfoot, and is really just an interesting variant of Bigfoot, with very similar qualities. Arkansas, the White River Monster. An urban legend in Arkansas is known as the White River Monster, and it's a large creature reportedly first spotted off the banks of the White River near Newport, Arkansas. The White River Monster is reported as having gray skin and as wide as a car and as long as 3 cars. And as news reports spread about this monster, the city began construction on a huge rope and net, but the program actually ended due to a lack of materials and funding. The creature was first spotted in 1915 and is even believed to have an impact on the Civil War. During the Civil War, the White River was used often for transportation, and the monster is supposedly blamed for overturning a boat. The monster was notably spotted again in 1937 and 1971, and there's over 100 confirmed sightings from 1915 to present day. Basically, one of your run-of-the-mill interesting river cryptids. California, the Dark Watchers. I actually have mentioned the Dark Watchers before on my channel, but I like them, so I'm going to mention them again. Oh, and the video I talked about them in is Scariest Mythical Creatures from Around the World, Part 3. The Dark Watchers are tall, sometimes giant-sized, featureless dark silhouettes often seen wearing brimmed hats or even carrying walking sticks. They're only seen during sunrise or sunset, and they are motionless, watching travelers from the horizon, typically seen along the Santa Lucia mountain range. The legend states that no one has been able to see them up close, and if you approach them, they vanish. These are harmless cryptids, and some believe they are simply a reminder that you are not alone in these woods, and to respect nature and your surroundings, or to be aware at all times. They serve as more or less of a gentle warning, and although creepy, I think they're pretty cool. Colorado, Slide Rock Bolter. Slide Rock Bolter is a really strange cryptid from lumberjack folklore, primarily during the 19th and 20th centuries. It is a creature that is believed to live in the mountains of Colorado, but only on mountains with a slope at an angle greater than 45 degrees. It has a huge head, small eyes, a big mouth, and a tail similar to a dolphin with big grab hooks. The best way to describe this cryptid is honestly just a big land whale that slides down mountains to eat people. This creature is said to have caused great unease amongst tourists visiting the mountains of Colorado, and it will often remain motionless for days at a time until groups of tourists walk by its path. At that point, it will release its hooks from the top of the mountain and slide down the mountain to gulp up the entire group of tourists, or at least so the legend goes. This is definitely an interesting cryptid, but it's kind of funny. And if you plan on going to the mountains of Colorado soon, make sure you get your protractor out to make sure the angle is less than 45 degrees. Or at least look out for any whale-looking things up the mountain. Connecticut, the Melonheads. The Melonheads are actually a folklore that exists in Ohio, Michigan, and Connecticut, but for this segment, we're only going to be focusing on the ones in Connecticut. The Melonheads are described as small humanoid beings with bulbous heads who occasionally emerge from hiding places and attack people. That's the basic gist. But in Connecticut specifically, according to one telling of the myth, Fairfield County was the location of an asylum for the criminally insane that burned down in the fall of 1960, resulting in the death of all of the staff and most of the patients, except for 10 to 20 inmates unaccounted for, which supposedly had survived and escaped into the woods. The legend states that the Melonheads' appearance is a result of them resorting to cannibalism in order to survive the harsh winters in the region and inbreeding, which caused their heads to swell up and deform. Less of a cryptid, more of like a fairy tale, mythical creature thing. If I haven't made it obvious yet, I'm kind of using the terms interchangeably. But yeah, that's the Melonheads. Definitely strange. Delaware, the Pukwudgie. If there's any Exploring with Josh fans watching this video, you might be familiar with the Pukwudgie. Pukwudgies are mythical creatures with shape-shifting abilities, also known for luring people to their deaths using magic and attacking people with poison arrows. They may seem initially friendly, but they turn hostile towards humans. Legend warns against annoying them while they are being friendly, as they retaliate with mischief and harm. Pukwudgie itself roughly translates to little man of the woods that vanishes. And as far as appearance goes, it looks like a human-like creature, albeit much shorter, much hairier, and sometimes seen either naked or with very primal-esque clothing. So if you're ever in Delaware or even live in Delaware, make sure you watch out for little elf-looking, mischievous little guys in the woods. Florida,
the muck monster. In late August of 2009, two members of a non-profit called Lagoon Keepers were attempting to remove what they thought were a log from the Lake Worth Lagoon in Palm Beach, Florida. That log proceeded to give the two non-profit members a runaround of the entire lake, diving deep whenever the boat came within 10 feet of it. During the chase, one of the men called this monster the elusive muck monster, and the other man filmed the encounter and put it online. The news picked up the story, and the city quickly took note and did almost everything they could to profit off of the situation. T-shirts were sold, specialty drinks were made in bars, and the city even installed viewfinders along the water. The only real visual that we have on this creature is its wood-like appearance from part of its back poking through the water briefly, which to me seems similar to a snapping turtle, but who knows. So anyways, this creature did end up being pretty good publicity and a decent boost in tourism, which is kind of funny. But as far as the cryptid goes, there's not much information. Georgia, Altamahaha, or Alti. Basically just the Loch Ness monster of Georgia. It's believed to live in small streams and abandoned rice fields, and sightings are few and far between. There's not a ton of information about this besides the fact that it's extremely similar to the Loch Ness monster, supposedly. But yeah, this one's kind of uninspired. Moving on. Hawaii. Menehune. Okay, this one's actually cool. Menehune are essentially small dwarves that live in the valleys and rural areas of Hawaii, hidden far, far away from human settlements. The Menehune are also described as superb craftspeople, building temples, fish ponds, roads, canoes, and houses. Some of these structures that Hawaiian folklore attributed to the Menehune existing. They were said to be in Hawaii before settlers from Polynesia migrated many centuries ago. Their favorite food is banana, but they also like fish. Legend has it is that the Menehune only appear during night, and that is when they spend their hours crafting masterpieces. Not much more is known about the Menehune, but I think they're pretty cool dudes. They're just doing their thing, living in a cool place, building cool stuff. You can't hate that. Good job, Hawaii. That's a cool cryptid, or folklore, or mythical creature, or whatever. Idaho. Charlie. Charlie, much like Alti, is basically just a Loch Ness monster dupe not worth mentioning. Sorry, Idaho. Do better. I honestly thought they would have some sort of potato monster, and maybe they do, but I didn't see it. Illinois. The Enfield Horror. This creature is described as having 3 legs, a short body, 2 short arms, and 2 pink eyes as big as flashlights. It stands at 4.5 feet tall and is grayish in color. It's definitely a gross and droopy looking creature, and it's honestly pretty creepy as well. Its first sighting was in the early 1970s in the small town of Enfield, Illinois, hence the name. During one of the first sightings, a very convincing story got out and got media attention, and this caused a lot of hunters to become excited about the prospect of finding and killing the Enfield Horror. For a while, tourists traveled and hunters began hunting, both looking for this gray creature in the woods. All of these hunts were unsuccessful, and as the hunting and tourism enthusiasm died down, 4 more sightings were reported since. Indiana. Mesha Kennebec. Mesha Kennebec, also known as the Manitow Monster, is an Indiana cryptid that is said to live in Lake Manitow for over centuries, being spotted by Native Americans and early settlers. By those who have seen it, it's been described as 60 feet long with the head of a bull with a serpent body. It is more or less of your run-of-the-mill lake monster, but it wasn't an exact ripoff of the Loch Ness Monster, so I thought I'd give it a bit more attention. Pretty cool, and the Native American ties are always interesting because their folklore is great, but that's about all I got. Iowa. Van Meter Monster. The Van Meter Monster is reported to be a 9-foot tall winged bat-like creature, also known as the Van Meter Visitor. This creature was said to shoot light from its horns and is immune to bullets. Witnesses made plaster casts of its 3-toed footprints after a confrontation. The creature has been seen disappearing into a nearby coal mine, and similar sightings have continued up until the 2010s. Today, there is even a commemorative event, and it's held around the anniversary of the sightings. Pretty cool. I like that it gets the community together. It seems scary. Kind of reminds me of Mothman. 8 out of 10. Let's keep going. This video is kind of evolving, so now it's more... now I'm just ranking these guys. Okay. If I lose any more brain cells, this might just end up being a tier list. Kansas. Deer Woman. Deer Woman, or sometimes known as Deer Lady, is a spirit from Native American mythology. She can be seen in 2 forms, either a beautiful young woman with deer feet or just a deer. And her general vibe can kind of shift depending on the context of who she's dealing with, but for the most part, she has her sights set on men who have harmed women and children, and to them, she is vengeful and murderous, typically known for luring these men to their death. Overall, Deer Woman's got a pretty cool vibe. Good job, Kansas. Kentucky. The Pope Lick Monster. Yeah, you heard that right. We're already off to a weird start. The Pope Lick Monster. Unfortunately, this monster is not known for licking the Pope, but it doesn't get much better. Pope Lick Monster, or more commonly known as Goat Man, is a legendary part man, part goat, and even part sheep creature, reported to live beneath the railroad that goes over Pope Lick Creek in Fisherville, Louisville, Kentucky. Legends about the Goat Man claim that it uses hypnosis and voice mimicry to lead trespassers on its its bridge either onto the tracks in the way of a oncoming train or to below the bridge where it can attack them with a blood-stained axe. Typically, Goatman would make its voice sound like the voice of either someone else or even potentially someone familiar to you, making you want to see who's talking to you and where they are. Some legends state that Goatman is so vengeful because he was treated so poorly during his lifetime for being such a different creature, at least different by human standards. And some legends state that Goatman is simply a reincarnation of a farmer who made a deal with the devil. Either way, he's definitely strange looking, and if you're passing by a bridge in Pope Lick, Kentucky, don't lick the Pope, don't go under the bridge, don't go over the bridge, and if you hear somebody you think you know, you don't. Get out of there. Louisiana. Fille Fouillée. To describe what you're looking at, let me give you a bit of context. The story of Fille Fouillée starts in Acadia. Legend states that there was a blacksmith named Will Smith. No, not Will Smith. Will Smith. And when Will Smith died and went up to heaven, he was given a second chance at life. But that second life he lived was not a good one. Unfortunately, he chose to do evil this time around. Because of this, the second time he died, the devil doomed him to live on Earth forever with only a single coal to warm him. That is why this cryptid or spirit is only really seen as a dimly lit orb in the distance. There is typically no figure associated with this creature. Fille Fouillée spends his time in the swamps of southern Louisiana trying to lure people out deep into the swamp to their death. It is advised that anybody near the swamp at night avoid following any strange dim lights in the distance, as the ending is never truly good. Maine. Kawakwa. Kawakwa is a cryptid from Abenaki folklore from northeastern United States, specifically Maine. The creature is described as a giant, cannibalistic, half-animal, half-human creature that roamed the forests of present-day New England in ancient times. The Kawakwa is described as being a former human whose heart turned to ice, either because of evil spirit possession or because they committed a crime that was truly dreadful, like cannibalism. The only sensation the Kawakwa is able to feel is an insatiable hunger, and their existence is pretty pitiful. They are no longer claimed to exist, so there is no risk to you or me, but if you have a time machine and go back to ancient times and decide to go to New England of all places, look out for the Kawakwa. It may want to eat you. And by may want to eat you, I mean he will lick and nibble you from head to toe. Maryland. Chessie. Can you guess what this creature is going to be? Did you guess another Loch Ness Monster type creature? Could you guess because the name is completely uninspired? Well, congratulations, you have a functioning brain. Chessie, not to be confused with Nessie as in the Loch Ness Monster, as in the cool one, is a reptilian type creature that is reported to be either black or brown that has been seen as early as 1936 in the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland. Not gonna go too deep on this one, pretty uninspired. Loch Ness Monster clone, Salmonella clone. Sorry, Maryland. Let's keep going. Massachusetts. Thunderbirds. The Thunderbird is a legendary creature, especially if you're a North American indigenous person who's really into art and culture. The Thunderbird is considered to be a supernatural being with supernatural power and strength. A Thunderbird can be best described as a very large eagle with supernatural powers. Some of those powers being the ability to create thunder by simply flapping its wings, and also the ability to cause lightning by flashing its eyes. The Thunderbird has very deep ties to indigenous people's history and culture, and for that reason, the history and lore is deep, and I'm definitely doing it a disservice by going over it this quickly, but it's pretty cool. 10 out of 10. Good job, Massachusetts. Michigan. The Michigan Dogman. The Michigan Dogman is essentially the Michigan equivalent of a werewolf, but it's still kind of cool. The Michigan Dogman is a cryptid that was allegedly witnessed in 1887 in the lower peninsula of Michigan. It is described as being a 7-foot tall, blue or amber-eyed bipedal canine with the torso of a man and a fearsome howl that sounds like a human screaming. According to the legend, the Michigan Dogman only appears in a 10-year cycle that falls on years ending in 7, for example, 2007, 2017, 2027. The majority of these sightings have taken place in the southern part of Michigan. And for as how ferocious and scary the Dogman may seem, many believers say that the Dogman can be scared away simply by clapping at it, which is kind of hilarious. Oh, and if you're able to scare away the Dogman without using your hands, give me a call. Only because I totally might need you to save me one day. Minnesota. The Wendigo. The Wendigo is by far one of the most well-known mythical creatures, folklore creatures, urban legends, cryptids, whatever you want to call it. If you're watching this video, you probably know about it. And honestly, for good reason. It's cool looking, the lore is deep, and it might even be real. I've already discussed it on the channel, but I'm gonna describe it again because it's really cool and I know you guys want to hear it. For starters, the Wendigo isn't just from Minnesota, it's kind of from all over the place, all across North America. I felt it was best fitting here because Minnesota was kind of slim pickings, and it was was a good middle ground between all of the possible locations Wendigos could be from. The Wendigo is often said to be a malevolent spirit, sometimes depicted as a creature with human-like characteristics which possesses humans. The victims of the Wendigo feel an insatiable hunger and have the desire to eat other humans and commit horrible murders often. In some representations, the Wendigo is described as a giant humanoid with a heart of ice and whose approach is signaled by its foul stench and sudden, unseasonable chill. If this sounds familiar, it's likely because we just spoke about the Kawakwa, which is a very similar creature with its hunger and heart of ice. And I'm not sure who came first, the chicken or the egg, but I know that the Wendigo is a lot more popular. Wendigos are definitely scary and super interesting cryptids, and I would recommend looking into them deeper or maybe watching this video about mythical creatures that mentions the Wendigo. But for the scope of this mega compilation, I'm gonna cut it here. Great job, Minnesota. Mississippi, the Pascagoula River aliens. The Pascagoula River aliens aren't just any aliens. They are the aliens associated with a pretty famous UFO sighting and alien abduction account from 1973. For context, on the evening of October 11th, 1973, 42-year-old Charles Hickson and 19-year-old Calvin Parker told the Jackson County, Mississippi Sheriff's Office that while they were out fishing, they not only saw aliens but were abducted by them. They claimed that the aliens paralyzed them but kept them conscious and examined them for hours before later releasing them. This isn't about the abduction, but actually about the aliens themselves. These aliens were described as having robotic slit mouths and crab-like pincers. They had more or less of a humanoid body commonly associated with gray-ish aliens, but these ones seemed just a little bit different. You be the judge if specific aliens count as cryptids, but in my case they do, and honestly Mississippi was kind of dry, so I thought this was interesting. Shout out Pascagoula. Missouri, the Ozark Howler. The Ozark Howler, unsurprisingly, is said to live in the dense forests of the Ozarks, which span across Missouri, Arkansas, and Kansas. But for this segment, we're focusing on the howlers that live specifically in Missouri. The howler is typically described as being bear-sized, with a thick body, stocky legs, and black, shaggy hair, accompanied with glowing red eyes and prominent horns. Its cry is often described as being the combination of a wolf's howl and an elk's bugle, also combined with the laugh of a hyena. Sounds like a pretty horrible trio. The howler is said to be a fierce hunter and a protector of the wilderness, also with supernatural abilities and a fierce protective nature. So if you're in the Ozarks, specifically in Missouri, and you don't want to encounter the Ozark howler, respect the wilderness, don't go out at night, and if you do hear a terrifying sound, just go home. Montana, the Flathead Lake Monster. Loch Ness Monster variant, but with antlers. The coolest thing about this cryptid is a Native American legend surrounding it, which I'm gonna tell now. According to legend, long ago, the first native tribe to live in the area lived in an island in the middle of the lake. One winter, while they were crossing the frozen lake to move to another camp, two girls saw antlers approximately 2 feet in length protruding from the frozen ice. Thinking the antlers belonged to some animals, the girls decided to chop them off and take them. While trying to take off these antlers with sharp rocks, the antlers started to shake and the ice split open all around them. The monster's head opened, appearing through the ice, and shook its giant antlers. These girls used special abilities to transform into balls and escape the monster, but half of their tribe drowned in that lake. That's the story. So, moral of the story, don't steal antlers you find in the ice, because if you do, you might live if you have the ability to turn into a ball, but you're gonna kill all your friends, so don't do it. Nebraska, the Alkali Lake Monster. The Alkali Lake Monster is a huge alligator-like horned creature that lives in, you guessed it, the Alkali Lake in Nebraska. It's not a direct Loch Ness Monster ripoff, so that's why I'm giving it a bit more love. This monster is claimed to have rough grayish brown skin and also is 40 feet long, and like I mentioned before, it has a horn in between its eyes on its head. The legend states that this lake monster consumes livestock in large quantities, causes earthquakes, and even disorients travelers that get too close to it. According to my research, I couldn't confirm if it was believed to be supernatural or not, but I'm gonna assume it was because not many creatures cause earthquakes. Unless they're super thick, which is a completely different story. Nevada, Tahoe Tessie. Nevada's Loch Ness Monster, moving on. New Hampshire, Wood Devils. Wood Devils are believed to be one or a small group of Bigfoot-like creatures in the woodland hills of Coos County, New Hampshire. They have been spotted since the 1930s and described as tall, around 7 to 9 feet, with shaggy tan gray hair and very similar to Bigfoot's, besides the fact that they are slightly skinnier. A strange trait about this cryptid specifically is that they refuse to hide behind behind trees. If they are already behind a tree, they will hide behind it. But if humans are coming near them and they are not near cover, they will simply stand still and stare at you until you leave. Kind of creepy, kind of cool. That's about it. New Jersey, the Jersey Devil. The Jersey Devil is a legendary cryptid that is said to inhabit the forests of the Pine Barrens in South Jersey. This cryptid is described as a two-legged, goat-like, bat-like creature with hooves. Let me explain. The creature is said to walk on two hooved feet, have a goat-like body and a horse-like head with two large, leathery, bat-like wings on its back. It's also said to have a forked or pointed tail as well. Oh, and its hands aren't hooves, its hands actually have claws. The legend states that it moves quickly and is often described as emitting a high-pitched, blood-curdling scream. This may sound obvious, but the New Jersey Devils, the official NHL team of New Jersey, is actually named after this cryptid, which is pretty cool. Now that I think about it, this might be the first time I've ever mentioned sports in this channel, which is kind of funny. New Mexico. Teratorns. Okay, this one's a bit interesting because this is actually a real creature kind of mixed with cryptid mythology. Teratorns are prehistoric birds that were the ancestors of modern day vultures. Skeletons that have been found measure their wingspans to be over 20 feet long, and they were thought to have weighed over 100 pounds, which for a bird is insane. These birds are presumed to be extinct, but they have found numerous skeletons. Why I mention this on this list is because in New Mexico, the Thunderbird cryptid mythology that we mentioned earlier exists in New Mexico as well, and it is believed that the Thunderbirds were potentially based off of the Teratorns, which existed long before ancient peoples, but they still somehow had knowledge of them and maybe even encountered them. New York, Champ. Champ is the Loch Ness Monster of Lake Champlain in New York. That's about it. North Carolina. Wampus. Wampus, or the Wampus cat, is a cryptid based in Appalachian folklore. It is described as a fearsome hybrid between a mountain lion and a woman, but kind of just displays itself as a mountain lion with 6 legs. Believers claim that the Wampus cat roams the wilderness, emitting eerie sounds to strike terror into the hearts of those who encounter it. It's simple, but kind of cool. I'll give it that. North Dakota. Thunderbirds. I don't know how I accidentally made this the same cryptid for 2 different states, and this is the 3rd mention I've had of this cryptid in this video, so yeah, Thunderbirds, woo, let's keep on. Ohio. Loveland Frogman. The Loveland Frogman is simply described as a humanoid frog creature that stands at about 4 feet tall. Honestly, more of a chill dude than a cryptid, but figured you guys would like him. Say hi, Frogman. Oh yeah. If you've made it this far, say hi Frogman in the comments to say hi to Frogman and also to confuse people that haven't made it this far yet. Oklahoma, the Oklahoma octopus. The Oklahoma octopus is a cryptid that is said to live in man-made freshwater lakes in Oklahoma where it attacks and kills unsuspecting swimmers, and that's it. Oregon, Gumbaroo. The Gumbaroo is described by early lumberjacks as being larger than a bear with tougher, shiny black skin that absolutely nothing could pierce. It is even claimed that bullets just bounce off the thing. And according to the legend, the only way to kill it is with fire. And if you set it on fire, it literally explodes. This cryptid does have a good name, so congrats, Oregon. Nice job, Gumbaroo. Pennsylvania, the Squonk. Shout out to Pennsylvania for having one of the most depressing cryptids there is. The Squonk is more or less of a pig-like creature that only walks around at dusk and dawn. It is covered with extremely loose skin that is littered with warts and moles. The Squonk is famously known for being perpetually unhappy and always crying, like a lot. Skilled hunters can even track down the Squonk by finding its tear-stained trail. And when the Squonk is concerned, frightened, or feels like it may be in danger, it can literally dissolve into a puddle of tears to escape any danger. Doesn't get much sadder than that. Rhode Island. Vampire Mercy Brown. The cryptid for this one technically is just vampires, but this story is kind of interesting and unique to Rhode Island specifically. The Mercy Brown vampire incident occurred in 1892 during what is known now as the New England Vampire Panic. At the time, tuberculosis was running rampant, and for some reason, people thought that this disease outbreak was caused by the influence of the undead. During this time, the people would perform rituals to banish the undead from our plane of existence forever. Why this is called the Mercy Brown vampire incident is because during this time, the Brown family had their daughter, Mercy, die of tuberculosis. Friends and neighbors of the Brown family believed that one of the family members was a vampire, although they didn't call them that at the time. This was in accordance to folklore at the time, which linked multiple deaths in a family to undead activity, aka vampire activity. The story goes a lot deeper, but as you know, this video is long. Rhode Island, vampires, let's keep going. South Carolina. The Gray Man. The Gray Man is a legendary cryptid from South Carolina that is considered a friendly ghost. He appears on beaches and shores, particularly before hurricanes and other strong storms. The legend states that he was on his way to propose to the love of his life when he was killed, and now his spirit wanders South Carolina, warning others of impending danger. The legend states that if you encounter the Gray Man before a storm, you will be protected and your entire house may be saved. This is a pretty interesting and potentially our first upbeat cryptid on the list, so good job, South Carolina. I like this one. South Dakota. Tekuhi. Tekuhi means big man in the Lakota language, who are the indigenous peoples of South Dakota. Tekuhi is said to be a supernatural being who serves as a guardian spirit, protecting land from invaders and malevolent creatures that hunt humans and animals. He is a cryptid that protects the nature and humans and animals from other cryptids, and for that reason, he's okay in my book, which is why I discussed this Bigfoot dupe. Tennessee. The Tennessee Wildman. The Tennessee Wildman is basically the opposite of Tekuhi. Like Tekuhi, he is a 7-foot tall, dark-haired, humanoid creature, although that's about where it ends. He has piercing red eyes and screams a disturbing war cry that frightens anything that hears it. He smells awful, kind of like Bigfoot, but he is extremely aggressive. The Tennessee Wildman is extremely strong, fast, and agile, and is extremely territorial as well. He has an obsession with targeting dogs and women, and although he is typically seen trying to attack women, he has never been successful, as these women always find a way to escape. What do you guys think? Evil Bigfoot, cool or not cool? Texas. Donkey Lady. Donkey Lady is the famous cryptid said to haunt the Donkey Lady Bridge in San Antonio, Texas. According to the legend, the bridge is inhabited by the spirit of a woman who is horribly disfigured by a fire, leading to her being referred to as the Donkey Lady. It is said that she haunts the bridge, appearing to unsuspecting travelers who pass by, and the legend also states that she may even chase or attack those who get too close to her bridge. Kind of feel bad for the lady. She got made fun of for something she couldn't control, but at least she's getting revenge. Good for her. Do you, Donkey Lady. Utah. Skinwalkers. No video about cryptids is truly complete until you mention skinwalkers, and this video is no different. In Navajo culture, a skinwalker is a type of harmful witch who has the ability to turn into, possess, or disguise themselves as an animal. Skinwalkers typically use these disguises or possessions to stalk their prey and kill and attack people. They also have other supernatural abilities such as super strength and voice mimicry to lead people to their certain death. The skinwalker lore is deep and goes far beyond the scope of this video, but I have made a video discussing them in the past. They're very cool, and check them out after this video if you want. Vermont. The Northfield Pigman. The Northfield Pigman is a cryptid or urban legend from Northfield, Vermont. Descriptions of the pigman vary, but he is typically described as a humanoid creature with the body of a large pig, but with the features of a man. Sightings of the pigman have been reported across rural areas surrounding Northfield and often in the vicinity of old farmhouses or abandoned buildings. Some interpretations believe that pigman is the result of an experimentation gone wrong or a spirit of a deceased farmer seeking revenge. Although the origins are still unknown and often debated. Pigman is definitely creepy and sometimes is even described as just a boy that went missing in the woods who decided to wear a pig's face as a mask. But yeah, lots of lore, kind of creepy. Good job, Vermont. Virginia. Snallygaster. Like almost every cryptid, descriptions of the Snallygaster vary, but it is often depicted as a fearsome dragon-like creature with large wings, sharp claws, and a metallic beak lined with razor-sharp teeth. According to the folklore, it preys on livestock and unsuspecting travelers, specifically children, by swooping down from the skies and snatching its victims. Some variants of the Snallygaster say it has tentacles instead of razor-sharp teeth, but either way, it's a terrifying-looking creature. Washington. The Conser Lake Monster. The Loch Ness Monster, but in Washington. West Virginia. Mothman. The legend of the cryptid known as Mothman originates from the 1960s in Point Pleasant in West Virginia. Mothman is described as a winged humanoid creature with glowing red eyes and is believed to be a sign of impending disasters. The Mothman legend has taken Point Pleasant by storm, and there is so much tourist attractions based around it, and I have covered Mothman in another video of mine, so I won't go too deep into details. But there are many stories where he is seen jumping at cars from the side of the road and jumping on the top of cars that are parked in rural locations at night. It is a creepy cryptid that showed up and almost as fast as it appeared, disappeared from the zeitgeist. It is now simply a figment of our imagination. Wisconsin. The Beast of Bray Road. The Beast of Bray Road is described as a 7-foot tall humanoid style creature covered in hair or fur with the head of a large wolf that also has glowing red or orange eyes. It's been seen running on 2 and 4 legs, and some reports describe it as being close to a werewolf, and others say it's more close to a Bigfoot style cryptid. Not really a 10 going on here, but what can you expect? It's Wisconsin. Just kidding, Wisconsin. I love ya. Wyoming. Jackalope. Admittedly, this is likely my favorite cryptid on the entire list. simply because I find it cute, and honestly, I hope it exists. Or at least did at one point. The jackalope is a cryptid that is described as being a rabbit with antelope horns, and that's basically it. They're pretty iconic in the Wyoming area, urban legend scene, and even pop culture as well. I know this video is alphabetical, but we kind of saved the best for last, unintentionally. And with that, bros, I have to say thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you know that I do take your feedback into consideration, and I know you guys have been asking for longer videos, and I know you guys have been asking for dark mode videos, so I thought with this video, I would give you both of those. Also, it's been a while since I talked about mythical creatures, cryptids, folklore, urban legends, all of it. So I thought, why not bring it back with this banger video?
The scariest cults from around the world. Imagine you're standing on the street just minding your own business when you get approached by a couple and they have some important information for you. They tell you that they are spiritual guides and they can help take you to a next level of existence beyond Earth and human comprehension. They say that you can transcend humanity by transforming into an immortal extraterrestrial being. It sounds like an interesting proposal. So you take a flyer and attend a meeting. And at this point, you can go either one of two ways. Your suspicions are either confirmed and you realize that you spoke to crazy people, or you believed you talked to some of the most important people ever, and in that instance, you just joined a cult. This cult is known as Heaven's Gate, and it was an American cult founded in 1974 by Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, who, like I mentioned, saw themselves as spiritual guides to a next level of human existence. Without spoiling the ending, Heaven's Gate is most commonly known for its mass suicides committed by its members, but the story goes a lot deeper than just the headlines. Nettles and Applewhite first met in 1972 and went on a journey of spiritual discovery together, and came out on the other side identifying themselves as two witnesses of Revelation, or the Book of Apocalypse in the Bible. This claim alone, and some clever convincing, was reason enough for them to start attracting hundreds of people to start at least paying attention to their movement in the mid-70s. And after a few years, they even had over a dozen members adopting a monastic lifestyle, dedicating their life to Heaven's Gate, and giving up all worldly pursuits beyond this cult, which is insane. This cult is commonly recognized as a UFO religion, primarily because the central belief of this group was that the followers could transform themselves into immortal extraterrestrial beings by rejecting their human nature. By rejecting this human nature, they would, by default, ascend to heaven, or what they would refer to as the next level. This cult primarily grew by Applewhite and Nettles trying to contact other extraterrestrials, aka like-minded people, aka other crazy people. They took out ads and flyers to promote meetings where they would recruit disciples that they called the crew. At these events, they would purport to represent beings from another planet who were looking for patients for an experiment. That alone is already creepy. They got straight to the crazy even on sign up. There was no easing into it, it seemed. They mentioned, though, that those who agreed to take part in their experiment would be brought to a higher evolutionary level. An interesting proposal, potentially, but still, red flags are everywhere. In 1975, Applewhite and Nettles preached at a motel hall in Oregon, and following that session, over 20 people sold all of their worldly possessions and essentially disappeared off the face of the planet, not being seen by family, friends, or even the general public at all. These people didn't just disappear, but they had become a part of Heaven's Gate, which at this point had already began going underground. Applewhite and Nettles changed their name to Doe and T, and they had led nearly 100 people across the country to ditch their families and join Heaven's Gate. The lore that they came up with is deep, and it's a really weird twist on a lot of existing religious texts and theories about history. But one of the more interesting claims they made is that they believe that Jesus himself was an alien, which is an interesting take for sure. But what's more interesting is what happened in October of 1996. The group rented a large house that they called the Monastery, which was a 10,000 square foot mansion in California. At the time, they were paying $7,000 per month in rent, cash, and they even took out alien abduction insurance on each of their members, with a $1 million payout per person. Which, who the hell is selling alien abduction insurance? But that's a side point. That's a video about insurance scams, not cults. Now, this house isn't the interesting event, but it's the precursor to what really put this cult on the map. Nearly 1 year into renting the monastery, Applewhite taped a video of himself entitled Doe's Final Exit, where he spoke on mass death and how it was the only way to evacuate this Earth. He was convinced that the comet Hale-Bopp was the sign that the group had been looking for, and speculated that there was a UFO following this comet. And because of this, Applewhite and 38 of his followers prepared a ritual death. This death lined up exactly with when the comet was closest to the Earth, so that their souls could reach the next level. In the following days, 39 people had taken a concoction of vodka and poison, and, like you may have guessed, died. There is so much crazy and honestly disturbing lore to this cult, but I think the best way to describe it is that they believe that humans were boring, aliens were cool, and if a human wanted to become an alien, they had to die. It's amazing what people are willing to believe and dedicate and sacrifice their life for. Oh, and if the Heaven's Gate logo looks familiar, Lil Uzi Vert used it as inspiration for his album cover, which is odd. Assuming you're a semi-reasonable person, you're likely not interested or swayed by the claims of an afterlife and UFOs and being a part of the Bible from random strangers. What a reasonable person may be interested in, though, is a community that worships God, people that are like-minded in faith, a faith that at surface level seems semi-reasonable. In this instance, you may be interested in the Children of God. This name already may sound familiar, and that's because Nick Crowley, a great YouTuber, just made a video about some of the lore involved with this cult. Specifically, the TV programs this cult was producing, which was insane. It was essentially propaganda pieces for children. And spoiler alert, it was pretty disturbing. But we'll get to that. The Children of God lore is deep, and I'll do my best to summarize it as neatly as possible. The Children of God was founded by a creep named David Berg in 1968. It initially attracted young followers with the message of love, communal living, and devotion, which may sound innocent enough. But the group soon became infamous for its controversial beliefs and practices. Most of these controversial beliefs and practices started to be introduced once the cult was more established. Initially, some of their beliefs were more conservative and aligned with the Bible, although it seemed that the group's beliefs started to morph to fit Berg's personal desires, which we'll get into. For example, initially the group was rather conservative and didn't even believe in hand-holding until marriage. But once Berg had an affair with his assistant, he then started spreading messages of polygamy, which turned into what he called sharing, which we'll get into, and that gets a lot darker. Before we get too into the weeds, let's give some context. This group was founded with a core focus on an apocalyptic prophecy, where Berg was claiming that the world was set to end in 1993. And the purpose of this group was to promote love and devotion to God so that they could be saved during this apocalypse. They spread their messages through song and dedicated as much time as possible to praising God before the end times. Child members of this group were not even educated because they saw it as a waste of time because the world was ending soon anyway. So all of the children and adults in this group were simply sitting, hanging out, singing songs, waiting for the end of the world, which to me doesn't sound like a great time. But that's just me. Floor Edwards, a previous member of the Children of God, said this about the cult's mindset at the time. Quote, "For many, it was euphoric thinking about the afterlife. We earned that spot in heaven. We were the chosen ones." That's definitely a take on it. Interestingly, Berg wasn't seen very often by most of the cult members, as at its peak, the group had over 10,000 members worldwide. Although he was in consistent communication with all of his followers through what he called Mo letters, which was essentially daily propaganda pieces, where he would take Bible verses and intertwine them with his own twisted doctrine, which, like I mentioned earlier, evolved over time. These Mo letters included instructions that his followers must follow, and strangely enough, a lot of the imagery in these letters was rather graphic. We'll say that. According to ex-members of the Children of God, Mo wrote over 3,000 of these Mo letters, which is insane. But these letters weren't the only way that the Children of God was able to get their message out. Like I mentioned, Nick Crowley made a great video about the TV series that the Children of God had created and that was televised called Life with Grandpa, in which he describes the TV show essentially indoctrinating children into the values of the group and the religious beliefs that were unsavory, to say the least. To really paint the picture, there's a scene in the show where a woman is shown as a robot with literal boobs, and Grandpa, aka David Berg, was talking about how much he loves this perfect woman. And there's many episodes with young girls singing about how their purpose is to cook, clean, and take care of the men in their life. That is honestly just a tame sampling of some of the cool stuff in this cult's kid show. Of course, I'm using cool ironically. Now, going back to the concept of sharing. Without getting too graphic, essentially, Berg was promoting love with no bounds, as he claimed that Jesus created love and sex for people to enjoy, and he thought the best way to honor God was to have it without limits, which to him meant with anybody at any time, consenting or not, which also included with children, which is obviously disgusting. Former members who were children at the time said that they felt pressured to do anything with anyone because they knew if they said no that they would be punished by God and potentially not accepted into heaven when the apocalypse came, which was, in their mind, soon. This, unsurprisingly, led to widespread allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse, of course, including minors. The Children of God faced significant backlash and legal scrutiny due to the reports of emotional, psychological, and sexual abuse among members, although that wasn't quite enough to take it down fully. That was a bump in the road for the group. After David Berg died, his assistant, who he was having the affairs with, took over the group and tried rebranding the group multiple times in an attempt to distance it from its dark past. And they even tried to renounce some of their harmful practices. However, the decades of trauma experienced by former members was an inseparable part of the cult's history. And with the death of David, the rebrands, and all of the allegations, the group went from over 10,000 members worldwide to today being a small underground internet community. And I personally hope it continues to shrink to the point of nothingness very soon. I'm sure the world not ending in 1993 also had a big part to do with it. Interestingly, multiple celebrities were actually involved with this cult, notably Joaquin Phoenix and Rose McGowan. Rose McGowan described her experience as extremely stressful, like she was walking a high-wire act. She was expected to be perfect physically and was even cut with a knife by another member when she had a blemish on her finger. How Rose was involved in this group was because her father was actually the leader of the Italian branch of the Children of God. But fortunately, once the Children of God started promoting child abuse, her dad separated from the group entirely. Joaquin Phoenix and his siblings in the 1970s were also involved in the group, and even traveled through Central and South America with the group, but didn't remain members for long, as initially they thought it was a dedicated religious group, but found out that it was much deeper than that and cut ties. It's upsetting enough when individuals are tricked into joining cults and doing unspeakable things and having horrible lives, but it's just downright disheartening and depressing when they get their children involved too. Likely unsurprisingly, the Children of God had an extremely high suicide rate, with many ex-members having lifelong trauma, psychological illnesses, and at the very least, horrible, unforgettable memories. But if you're not interested in aliens, and you're not interested in any sort of religious movement, what if a man approached you and told you that he could tell you when you're going to die? This, to anybody, may seem like an interesting proposal, but the more info you start to get, the more the cracks start to show. This man referred to himself as Lou Castor and claimed that he was 1,000 years old and he was the combination of 3 different angels. He claimed that he had died and came back to life and that now he himself can predict deaths accurately, among other things. Potentially one of the biggest draws for some is that Lou claimed that if you were close to him, he could not only predict your death, but bring you back to life, which for most people sounds like a good reason to stick around. But on top of the claims of being resurrected, from a surface level, it looked like the members of this group lived a relatively lavish lifestyle. Lou had a compound in Wichita, Kansas, where he had 10 members of the group living with him. Everybody who was completely provided for with food, shelter, technology, toys, gadgets, ATVs, luxury vehicles, anything these members could want, they had, and it was all provided for by Lou. But interestingly enough, nobody knew what Lou did for work. He said he had stocks and bonds and a cattle ranch down in Texas, but nobody could directly pinpoint his wealth, and it didn't seem like anybody was extremely concerned because they were directly benefiting from it, although it definitely came with a price. Having a 10-person commune with luxury vehicles in Wichita, Kansas, definitely drew attention. But for this cult, that wasn't an issue. And Lou was an active participant in the community. He would donate to the police, have community-wide barbecues in his backyard, and even had an ATV track on his 10-acre property where anybody could come and enjoy the track. This sense of community definitely allowed people to feel a little bit more comfortable, and I think people assumed that if he had something to hide, he wouldn't be so flashy, which may seem reasonable, but you could also say this is more or less of a John Wayne Gacy approach. But here's the thing. Behind closed doors, unspeakable things were happening, and although on the surface it seemed like an outgoing, luxury lifestyle of cool people just having fun, it was really anything but that once you got to the core of the group. When Angel's Landing went from Texas to Wichita, Kansas, they actually gained 3 new members: Lou's real estate agent and 2 young daughters. This real estate agent sold Lou the property, and upon meeting him, she felt very compelled to not only be close to him, but protect him. And he shortly after confessed to her that he was an angel. Because of this information, this real estate agent uprooted herself and her 2 young daughters from Missouri to Wichita, Kansas to join the commune, leaving her husband and her children's father behind. I'm assuming you can guess where this is going, and it ended up with Lou assaulting and abusing both of these young girls. But not only that, combining it with mental manipulation to make them feel like it was almost normal, which it obviously wasn't at all. In 2003, the story got a lot more publicized, as one of the members living in the commune had passed away. This member had seemingly fallen, hit their head, and then fell into the pool, which caused them to drown and die, which obviously got a lot of attention but wasn't necessarily considered suspicious, at least not legally. The death aligned with most accidental drowning deaths and was not considered for having any foul play, although that didn't mean that there wasn't any questions stirring about this commune within the community. At this time, unbeknownst to Lou and the rest of the commune, the police were actually closely monitoring the commune, but not for the reasons you may have thought. They were being monitored by the narcotics department because Lou had unexplained wealth, and their assumption was that there was an illegal drug operation or something along those lines funding this 10-acre ranch with seemingly unlimited money. And with the news breaking of this death on the property, some members in the community had their own questions as well. This member that they lost was considered to be the mother of the group, and she was Lou's right-hand woman. And it was a tragic loss within the group and outside of the group, as she was somebody that people looked up to and at least had a positive relationship with publicly. Following the death of the member who passed away in the pool, the other members of the group were waiting for Lou to bring her back, as he claimed that this was an ability of his. And after some time passed, Lou changed his story and claimed that he doesn't want to bring Patricia back. Lou claimed that where Patricia is now is much better than where we are, and that our goal is to meet her where she's at and not to bring her back here. And I suppose that was a satisfactory response to some of the members. And although the death was ruled as accidental, the FBI was interested, to say the least. They began looking into a Lou Castro and realized that there is no record of this person existing. No documents, no birth certificate, no driver's license. They were dealing with a ghost, until they found one piece of information referencing the name. This was an obituary for a woman he used to live with in a previous smaller commune. This woman had passed away with her new boyfriend and daughter during a leisure flight, and unfortunately, shortly after takeoff, this entire group passed away. It's an interesting side note, but Lou was previously a plane mechanic. That, again, was ruled as an accidental death. But the coincidences are starting to kind of fall apart here. 3 years after the death of the woman in the pool, her husband, another member of Angel's Landing, was killed as well. He was working on his car and laying underneath a vehicle when his jack failed, crushing and killing him. The unfortunate and tragic death of this second member of Angel's Landing was a pivotal moment in discovering the truth. Like I mentioned, the Angel's Landing group was already under investigation secretly by the FBI and local authorities. But once 2 accidental deaths took place within 3 years, they cranked up their search and began looking at alternative means of information. And one thing they found that cracked this case wide open was the insurance payouts on these group members. Both Patricia, the woman who died in the pool, and her husband, who died under the car years later, had large life insurance policies, both of which specifically paying out to the Angel's Landing group, which was 100% controlled by Lou Castro. Each of these policies paid out over $1.2 million. And suddenly, things are starting to make a lot of sense. Somebody who's able to predict deaths and then have them magically happen, somebody who has accidental deaths magically follow him around, and somebody who has an unexplainable amount of wealth, but no source of income. All now starts to make a lot more sense when you realize that there may be some foul play going on here. But in case that's not enough to make you convinced that there was something really strange going on in this cult, 2 years after the husband of the initial woman who died passed away, there was a third death within the group. It was the death of the real estate agent who moved into the commune to protect him. This same woman that had 2 young daughters in the group. Lou got her 2 young daughters together and told them that it was her mother's time and that she was going to die shortly. Obviously, they were extremely upset and didn't want to believe it, and they told their mom. And their mom didn't seem too fazed and reassured them that she wasn't going anywhere and that she was going to be fine. But unfortunately, 2 days later, she passed away in a horrible car accident. And at that point, detectives were no longer allowing this to go on anymore. Once again, a life insurance payout was due to hit Lou's account any day. And coincidentally, the previous balance was getting pretty low from the last payout. It's almost like this was how he was funding his lifestyle. At this point, detectives were just going to his property and had a unique plan to collect fingerprints to try to get more information. They knocked on Lou's door and they told him that they were looking for information on local criminals and had pictures of criminals that they wanted him to potentially identify. The detectives entered his home and were starting to show him pictures, hoping to get fingerprints on the photographs, but they noticed that Lou was only grabbing these photos with his fingernails, meaning that he knew what was going on and that they were not going to get any fingerprints. Eventually, they were able to get him on charges of bank fraud, but realized that they needed to get him on these murders if they wanted him to serve any substantial time. And at this point, the stars almost aligned, because the eldest of the 2 young girls who were a part of this group at this point was an adult, and had met a man who shortly became her boyfriend. Not long into dating, they had a moment and she opened up to him about everything. And that night when she went to bed, he went to the FBI website and informed them about everything that was going on in this strange strange cult in Wichita. Surprisingly, they were quick to respond, collected her statement, and began a full-blown investigation on all of these claims. At this point, they were able to speak to the younger daughter as well, where they were able to collect all the information they needed to put this man away for a serious amount of time. During this Lou person's trial, it was revealed that his name isn't Lou at all, and that was only one of his many aliases, and that his name is Daniel Perez, and he has an extensive history of sexual abuse and much more. And the result of this trial happened in 2015, when Daniel Perez, aka Lou Castro, was sentenced with 80 years in prison. Unfortunately, all of the deaths involving Angel's Landing were still ruled accidental, but they did have a strong enough case through all of the other crimes to put him away for the rest of his life. Okay, I know this is a cult video and not a true crime video, but for Angel's Landing specifically, the beliefs were rather simple. And it wasn't even super religious, honestly. This mysterious, wealthy man just claimed that he was an angel and could predict deaths and save people near him if they did die. And he also required intimacy with children to maintain his powers. Although in reality, he was just a pedophile who was killing his own cult members for insurance payouts to fund his lifestyle. So the religious beliefs are simple, but the lore of the actual story is insane. And I thought you guys would appreciate this twisted story. I know we focused on a lot of mind-bending, twisted, pseudo-religious, disgusting beliefs, so I wanted to kind of focus on the reality of the life in these cults in this story. But the more research I did, the more invested I got in this story. And well, here we go. Before we get into the last cult of this video, I just want to say that it is the unfortunate reality that there is so many crazy and scary cults that have existed and still exist to this day. And although I hand-selected a few for this first video, I do have a sizable number of other cults I do want to discuss, although I didn't want to make this video extremely long in case it wasn't something you guys were interested in, because I haven't really discussed cults on the channel before. So if you guys are interested about more scary and truly disturbing cults, let me know in the comments or leave this video a like. This sort of engagement helps me understand what videos you guys actually want to see. But with that, let's get into our final cult, of this video at least. Let's say that you have absolutely no interest in any sort of religious group at all. Let's just say that you're interested in history, and let's say that maybe you found a particular interest with the Knights Templar, the Catholic military group tasked with protecting the Holy Grail. Perhaps that's an area of interest for you. Well, what if you were approached by some individuals who claimed to be the descendants of that military group, and claimed to hold their ideals and then some? You may be interested in hearing them out. And what if these people claimed to you that not only were they the descendants of the Knights Templar, but one of the members was also the reincarnation of Moses from the Bible and King Tut's dad? At that point, you're likely gone, but let's say you're still a little interested. But here's the catch. Even if you're potentially interested in hearing them out, you have to be approved. Specifically through a sizable donation, as this cult is a pretty elitist group, with a group size at its peak of only around 300 to 400 members. So unless you were really wealthy, you weren't even able to hear them out, because they believed that only the richest were even worthy of hearing their message. This was the message of the Order of the Solar Temple, a Neo-Templar movement and a cult. This group had members in Canada, Switzerland, and France. One of the founders of this cult actually had a child with another cult member and believed that this child was a perfect child and that it was a higher being, and that any children that were to happen within the cult would be higher beings as well too, to help his daughter on her purpose. The cult grew and grew, and over time there was a lot of mismanagement happening between the two founders who didn't speak much about the direction of the cult. One leader was focusing on the inner workings of the cult, specifically the meditations, ceremonies, and day-to-day management, and the other leader was focused on the recruitment process, essentially running seminars and spreading the message of their special little group. Because this cult required very significant financial backing, members started to become uneasy on where their money was going, as the cult seemed to have not been growing as much as it once was. And this perfect higher level baby was now a teenager, and she was starting to rebel against her own father as well. And in 1991, one of the ex-members actually sued the group, which definitely started to show the writing on the wall for this elitist cult. And the next year, in 1992, one of the cult leaders was actually arrested for trying to buy illegal firearms in Canada, which is some unfortunate foreshadowing for what's about to happen. Later that year, people were becoming more and more restless, as not only were they unsure about where their money was going, but at this point there were so many unfulfilled spiritual promises that people were starting to not believe any of the claims of these cult leaders. This is where things get dark. As the cult was beginning to crumble and they were losing members and backing, they felt that they needed to figure out something quick, and they decided that they needed to have a transition within their movement. This was a transition to another world. At this point, they began to prepare themselves and certain high-ranking people within the Solar Temple that they believed would be highly favored in this new world, aka people that they probably thought they could manipulate. While they were prepping their members about how to transition into this new world, they were also planning how they would get revenge for those who they felt betrayed them, aka people who saw through the lies and left. The spree of this cult's revenge, starting with highly ranking cult members showing up at the door of previous cult members and stabbing their 5-month-old baby in the heart, as the leader of the Solar Temple claimed that this baby was the Antichrist, when in reality, the parents of this baby, who were also murdered in this horrific event, were simply people who didn't listen to the Solar Temple's demands, which were that they didn't get married and didn't have this baby because it wasn't what the higher beings wanted. It was essentially a power struggle that these former members were no longer interested in playing into. After this horrific murder, there was other instances of strange murder suicides until one of the most insane events associated with this cult happened. On the 5th of October in 1994, 23 people were found dead in a burning chalet in Switzerland. Their bodies were arranged in a circle, and they were all wearing ceremonial robes. After this mass death event, which was more murder than suicide, as most of the participants in this group didn't realize that they were going to be killed and left in a building that would be set on fire. Regardless, in total, 74 people died over the course of the multiple murders and mass murder suicides that happened because of the order of the Solar Temple. And it's not even known how many of these deaths were suicides and how many of these deaths were murders. Because the founders of this cult were killed in these rituals and any of the remaining members went into hiding, the authorities were stumped at what to do because there was nobody to charge and not much that they could do, as most of the participants were gone as well. The result was an extremely strengthened anti-cult movement in Europe, specifically in Francophone Europe. As this event was extremely publicized, the word was finally out about the danger that can be caused by cults. I suppose the one true silver lining about cults is the fact that they always seem to be self-imploding, although even a few moments of existence for the cults that I mentioned today are longer than they should have ever existed. None of these people needed to be hurt, psychologically damaged, abused, assaulted, or killed. And if anything, I hope this video shines a small light on the terrifying world of cults, manipulation, and abuse that's possible.
Bro, what are you watching? Oh, dude, I'm just watching the show about people that got killed, tortured, murdered, abused, beaten, mutilated. Why? I don't know, man. It's just so calming and peaceful, honestly. That's concerning. Whether you belong on a list or just have a morbid curiosity on how these twisted people's minds work, this video is for you. One thing to quickly note is that this list is not based off kill count alone. The scary factor is based off of their general vibe, their story, and also their methods. Let's begin. Starting off strong, we have Ted Bundy. This man is literally nightmare fuel. Why was Ted so scary? For me personally, it comes down to a few reasons. Primarily being how unassuming he came off. He was literally a wolf in sheep's clothing. He was well-educated, charismatic, charming, although he had a truly twisted and dark side that only came out once you were alone with him. Besides him being almost completely hidden in plain sight, he was also a master of escape and literally escaped police twice. And after the second time he escaped, he committed 6 more murders, which is literally insane. Something that I find completely ironic is that Ted actually attended law school for a year, which is super random, but I mean, it's not the first time something like that's happened. Once he was finally caught, he eventually admitted to over 30 murders, abducting, assaulting, and murdering young women. And during his trial, he even partially represented himself. And during his sentencing, he literally proposed to his girlfriend. This dude was loving the attention and is a complete lunatic. Next up, we have Harold Shipman, aka Dr. Death. If you thought that name was bad, trust me, it gets worse. Harold was a family doctor in the small town of Hyde in the United Kingdom. Harold was well known and well respected in his community, and a majority of his clients were the elderly. This might seem a little bit random, but this fact is very important. Now, let's kind of step back and look at his history. In his early years, he was the primary caretaker for his mother with cancer, and that led him to seeking out medical practice. He became a doctor, had a family, and had a successful practice, although he did end up developing a drug habit that almost cost him his practice. He was fined on multiple drug charges and even went to rehab, but was considered cured by the end of his treatment and was free to practice once again. Once he continued his practice is when things really began to take a turn. Specifically, elderly women began to die under his care. Shipman would use any reason possible to use a hypodermic needle on his patients, which he would use to deliver them a deadly dose of morphine, causing them to overdose. The interesting thing is this was the same medicine he gave his mother when he was younger. Like Ted Bundy, Shipman is terrifying because of how unassuming he was. Not only was he respected in the community and well-known and a family man, but he was also a family doctor. Probably one of the last people that you would assume to be ending people's lives intentionally. Another really scary factor was that his patient base was so vulnerable. And unfortunately, early on, a lot of his victims were just written off because of old age. Shipman was found out because before he killed his last victim, he modified her will to have her leave everything to her family doctor, aka Shipman. Her family was suspicious and they investigated. After a thorough police investigation, it was discovered that Dr. Death was responsible for over 215 deaths. Absolutely terrifying. Third up, we have Andrei Chikatilo, aka the Rostov Ripper or the Butcher of Rostov. He was a serial killer from Soviet Russia. The fact that he was in Soviet Russia actually played a big part in the reason why he was able to go on for so long. The state-controlled media was not allowed to talk about serial killings or anything of the sort, specifically because they believed that they did not have that issue. They didn't have serial killers, they thought. They believed that to only be a Western phenomenon. Following the trend, Chikatilo was just an unassuming traveling businessman, although his urges were much deeper and much darker. And unfortunately, Chikatilo was the type of person known as a necrosadist, someone who gained arousal from pain and violence and murder. Chikatilo targeted runaways, prostitutes, and homeless people as they were considered undesirables or less dead. Over time, the evidence was undeniable and the police were starting to suspect a group was at the loose, and even the general public was starting to believe that there was a werewolf just because of how gruesome the bodies were left. Unfortunately, these investigations were not fruitful simply because they were not looking in the right places. They were literally investigating satanic cults and recent psychiatric ward alumni. It wasn't until they brought in a psychiatrist that they were able to begin making progress and realize that maybe the killer was a normal seeming businessman who could be among us. In an interesting turn of events, Chikatilo was literally caught at a bus stop talking to a potential victim and was found with Vaseline, rope, and a knife in his briefcase. Although once he was brought in, his blood did not match the DNA on the killings and he was only held for a theft he committed. It wasn't until a few years later he was once again brought back in to the police station, and at this point they knew they had to get him. Although they didn't have much evidence and time was ticking before they had to release him again, it only took a 2-hour conversation between Chikatilo and the psychiatrist to have Chikatilo crack and confess to everything. Chikatilo was responsible for the gruesome death of 56 young men and women and was sentenced to death by a bullet in the back of the head. All right, things have gotten pretty dark, but we're just getting started. Let's just take a quick breather together. It's so crazy to think about how twisted these individuals are. Something I wanted to quickly mention is that this video is in no particular order. These individuals do not deserve a ranking, and I will not be giving them one. All right, buckle up. We're jumping back in. Next up, bringing us back to the US, we have Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer is probably one of the most infamous and well-documented serial killers of all time. If you know anything about Jeffrey Dahmer's story, it's not hard to believe why he's on this list. He is one of the most depraved individuals likely to ever exist. From a very young age, he was experiencing intense, violent thoughts, and it didn't take long for him to begin acting on them. From the years of 1978 until his arrest in 1991, Jeff had killed 17 people in uniquely horrific and gruesome ways. Jeff would drug, assault, murder, assault again, chop up, eat, and more to his victims and the bodies of his victims. Not only would he drug, assault, murder, and eat his victims, but he would also mutilate their bodies and keep parts of their body as souvenirs. He even said himself that this made him feel closer to his victims. He says that he didn't want to kill anybody, it was just his only option as he wanted companionship. According to him, his ultimate goal wasn't to murder, he simply wanted a slave who he could control completely and not have to worry about any of their wants or desires. This man was truly, truly twisted. And because there was no death penalty in Wisconsin, he was actually sentenced to 973 years in jail, although he was murdered in jail by a cellmate, thankfully. Following the trend of disgusting, disturbing cannibals, we have Joachim Kroll, a disturbing serial killer from Germany. Joachim had an IQ of 76, which is just above the line of being considered mentally challenged. Kroll would primarily find his victims by either going to smaller towns outside of where he lived, or simply strolling through and hiding in the forest waiting for victims to pass by. Kroll targeted women and young girls specifically, with his youngest victim being 5 years old. He would typically start a conversation with a victim and then shortly after strangle them to death and then assault their corpse. He shortly after began cutting chunks of his victim's body off and taking them home to eat. The bodies of his victims were typically found a few days after the incident, although they were never linked to him. And one of the most unfortunate parts of his story is that typically people close to the victim would be considered primary suspects, and there was multiple completely innocent suspects who ended their own lives out of sheer frustration and embarrassment of being considered a suspect. As I'm probably sure you've realized at this point, it's very common that a lot of these people were not necessarily deemed to be serial killers just at a first glance. Even in his own apartment building, Kroll was known as Uncle Kroll to the local children, as he would give them treats and allow them to play with dolls in his apartment, which he kept to lure the children. Kroll was eventually caught after he killed a neighborhood child. He tried to dispose of the remains of this child he didn't want in the toilet in the shared bathroom, and as he left the bathroom with the toilet clogged, he told one of his neighbors not to go in there. The toilet was clogged. His neighbor still went to use the bathroom and saw the horrible mess that was in the toilet. He contacted the police, and the police quickly investigated and questioned Kroll directly. They forced their way into his apartment and saw that he was cooking a stew. Kroll quickly admitted to everything, and they noticed that the stew literally contained human remains from the victim they were searching for. This man was seriously a monster. Moving over to South America, from Colombia specifically, we have Pedro Lopez, also known as the Monster of the Andes. If you thought it was frustrating and just nonsensical how the police didn't catch any of these people earlier, you're gonna absolutely hate how this story goes. Lopez was literally found guilty of murdering 110 girls in Ecuador alone, but he also confessed to killing an additional 240 women across Peru and Colombia. Now, obviously for having over 300 alleged murders, he is obviously sentenced to death, right? No? Well, he's at least sentenced to life in prison, right? What if I told you that he was literally released on good behavior and now his whereabouts are completely unknown? I'm not making this up, by the way. Pedro Lopez was literally released in 1998 on good behavior and now his whereabouts are not known. I seriously cannot fathom whose idea this was and how they could justify this at all. On top of being somebody who just murdered hundreds of people, something that is extremely scary about this person right now is the fact that they were born in 1948, meaning that right now in 2023, if they're still alive, they're only 75 years old, meaning that if you just see an old person walking down the side of the road, they might be the monster of the Andes. Insane. This next entry on our very disturbing list brings us back to where we started in the USA. This entry is our third American and final entry. His name is John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy is probably one of the most deranged individuals on this list, and if you've heard of Jeffrey Dahmer, you've probably heard of John Wayne Gacy. Gacy was a businessman and politician and was a liked and respected community figure. Like most people on this list, he was rather unassuming and, unfortunately, living a double life. Gacy had a family, a wife, a child, but that didn't stop him from assaulting young men, and although they were silent for some time out of fear for their lives, eventually they came out with their story, and Gacy was charged and imprisoned. Like the previous entry on this list, he was released on good behavior. Absolutely wild. After he was released from prison, he was essentially able to get a fresh start in life and was able to get a job, find a new wife, and start a construction company that was able to be quite lucrative, although it wasn't long until he was at his antics once again. Gacy developed an alter ego named Pogo the Clown, which allowed him to express parts of himself he felt that he had to repress. He appeared at birthday parties, community events, and did magic for children in the hospital. Unfortunately, these displays only brought him closer to his darker self. Gacy began cruising around at night in his full clown getup and would force young boys to get in his vehicle at gunpoint and then assault them and murder them and bury them in his basement. Gacy was eventually caught because his basement was so full of bodies. His last victim he actually had to ditch in a local river. This body was shortly after found, and the police were able to connect the dots and immediately began investigating Gacy. It wasn't long before they got a warrant, searched the basement, and found the bodies. It's interesting because Gacy always denied the accusations and even claimed that the bodies in his basement was a setup to destroy his political career. This man was a complete lunatic. And with that, we conclude my list of the scariest serial killers from around the world. Let me know in the comments the most infamous serial killer from your country if I didn't mention one already. This video is only my 5th video, but was definitely the toughest video I've ever made. Doing research on this video was honestly pretty brutal, and I tried to keep this video as tame as possible for what it was. And if you want detailed, explicit explanations of what happened with these people, there is tons of video out there around that.